All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. There's so many folks on today, so thanks for joining, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and I'll invite James while I'm doing that to offer some opening remarks.
Well, thanks, Jenny. That made it sound like I was going to say more than I was planning to. By way of opening remarks, I just wanted to thank everyone for being here this evening. We've been working on, well, the work on the zoning diagnostic occurred mostly last spring and into the summer. And then over the course of the last couple of months, we've been collecting comments and questions about this report. And we're gearing up. I'll kind of preview next steps. We're gearing up for our next steps of finalizing a copy of this report for presentation to the Planning Commission and City Council at the end of the month. But tonight is about hearing from you. So we're looking forward to your questions and comments at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'm going to kick this over to Jenny. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So yes, thank you everyone for being here. It's been a while. Last time we met, I think, was in March. We have had a few new members since then. We won't go through all of the list of members on the steering committee. There's quite a group of you, but there's a full list on the website that's updated, and you'll see some new faces tonight. So my name is Jenny Koch, for those of you who might not have met me before virtually or in person, and I am the consultant team project manager for Cville Plans Together. Tonight, you'll also hear from a few other folks. We have from Code Studio, Christy Dodson, and from HRNA, we have Callahan Seltzer. You'll also obviously be hearing from James Fries from the city. And we have some other folks who might chime in as we go through discussion. For example, Lee Einsweiler from Code Studio is also on the line, and Dina Roadside from RHI. A couple of reminders before we get started. We are recording this session. You probably got a notification about that. It'll be posted online, hopefully tomorrow. The slides, the presentation slides are posted on the website on cvilleplans-together.com, but all steering committee members should have received them already. Everyone else can view them on the website. So tonight our focus, as James mentioned, is walking through an overview of this document that's called the Draft Zoning Diagnostic and Approach Report. We're also going to be walking through the Draft Inclusionary Zoning Analysis. Toward the end of our meeting, we'll also give you an update on summer engagement activities, ways we've been reaching out to folks to talk to them and let them know what's going on. And then we'll talk through next steps for the zoning rewrite process. We've also, as we go through these agenda items, we've built in a place for steering committee questions and discussion at the end of each of the more major topics, number 2, 3, 5, and 6 on here. And we've also built in a little brief break in the middle, since this is slightly longer than our standard meetings. As we go through all of this tonight, we do want to keep in mind a few ground rules, just setting the stage, making sure we can hear from everyone. We know this is a large group of people with a variety of perspectives, and so we really want to make sure we can hear from everyone for those who want to share their thoughts tonight. So we ask as much as possible if you can, make sure you share all the thoughts you have, but keep them as concise as possible. We'd appreciate that. But we do, of course, welcome you to, if you'd like to share any quite long comments, you're welcome to share those in written comments by email. When we go through and are discussing each topic, when the team is presenting, we'd invite you to use the raise your hand feature on Zoom if you have a question. And then when we get to the end of the section, we'll go through sort of questions, raised hands in the order perhaps that they were raised. But if you would rather sort of present a question or get it out there as we're talking, you can put it in the chat box as well. You can either chat with the panelists, which is the advisory committee and staff that are on the call, or you can chat with everyone. So then all attendees will be able to see your question or comment. Obviously, please keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking, just to lessen the chance of any outside noise. And then as folks often do, as we usually do, just if we can refrain from interrupting while others are speaking, that's what we'd prefer to do. And that's not a thing we have a problem with on here, but just making sure that's what we're using as our benchmark here. So before we dive into the details, a couple overview points here. At this meeting, we're going to look to gather your feedback on these two draft documents. We welcome your comments today, your questions today, but the public comment period extends through September 6th. So you're welcome to continue sending comments through the week and through the weekend if you'd like. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to walk through the purpose of each of these documents at a very high level. But in general, I wanted to remind all of us that this zoning rewrite is the third and final piece of Cville Plans Together, which included the Affordable Housing Plan and Comprehensive Plan update. And those have both been completed. And our focus with the zoning rewrite is to focus on incorporating the goals and strategies from those two previous documents and that process into the zoning ordinance, along with other identified issues in the zoning ordinance. So that's always sort of the goal we're working toward here. With the draft zoning diagnostic and approach report, this was released in mid-June this summer. And this document identifies issues with the current zoning ordinance and establishes our proposed process to updating the zoning ordinance. As noted previously, again, the goal is to address needs we've identified in the comprehensive plan and affordable housing plan, as well as other needs identified from staff and community feedback and from all of you. I want to emphasize we haven't, in this document, as you probably have seen, we're not proposing a new zoning map yet or draft zoning text. What this does is show how some of the residential land use categories will be translated potentially from the comprehensive plan to the zoning ordinance and starts thinking about some of the other changes to be made. So in general, the purpose of the summer comment period and this meeting is to get your input on this before we move with the drafting. The second piece of the discussion tonight is the draft inclusionary zoning analysis. In that previous report, it described the process we were going through to complete this analysis, which was still underway when that diagnostic and approach report was shared earlier in the summer. So releasing this document, which came out more recently, this walks through the analyses that were completed related to addressing affordability in both lower intensity residential areas and higher intensity residential areas, and identifies the draft recommendations for incentivizing the inclusion of affordable units in development or redevelopment projects. So as we walk through the sections of the discussion tonight, we're going through these reports at a high level to get your feedback. With that being said, I think we can go ahead and dive into it. So I will invite at this time Christy from Code Studio, our zoning experts. We'll be walking through the next two sections, and then we'll take a brief break before we talk about the housing affordability portion.
Thanks, Jenny. Like Jenny said, I'm Christy Dodson from Code Studio, and I'm going to be joined tonight by Lee Einsweiler. So we'll tag team any questions or discussion points you may have as we go through the slides. I am going to try to keep this at a relatively high level. So if hopefully you've had a chance to read through the documents and this all will look very familiar to you. Really this meeting is to get feedback from you all. So I'm going to try to provide some context, some commentary on what we were thinking as we went through both the residential testing portion and also the zoning recommendations. But at the end of this, we of course would like to get your thoughts and feedback on the work that we've done thus far. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to talk about the residential testing and, to really set the framework of why we did this. The whole point of the zoning ordinance is this is the primary tool that we're going to use to implement the new future land use map and the comp plan that you just passed. So in thinking about that, we wanted to start off and say, okay, we have these new land use categories, we have the map, and we want to try to understand how that links up with your development patterns on the ground and what some of these infill projects, what some of these housing types may look like, and how those may or may not align, and what we should be thinking about whenever we're drafting zoning districts. So this residential testing was really thinking about your existing development patterns, what some of those infill housing types could be, and then thinking about how we should write these rules and regulations in zoning. This is your implementing tool, and we want to make sure that those tools work for you and work for Charlottesville. So we're going to walk through that in a little bit more detail so that you can understand a bit of our methodology and hopefully get some feedback from you all on what you think about some of these development types. So this residential testing, as I said, really is looking at this idea of infill development. We'll talk about the difference between infill and greenfield a bit later on when we get into the zoning recommendations. But for the most part, Charlottesville is pretty built out, and a lot of these housing types that are going to exist are going to be infill. That means it's going to happen sort of in and around where you have existing development within Charlottesville. There aren't many places that exist that are just, wide open that you could come in and drop development. So any new development that happens in these housing types are going to have to happen within sort of existing neighborhoods and existing contexts. And the situations and the trade-offs that exist with infill development are unique to infill development because you have different constraints you're trying to work around. So we wanted to think about that as we're modeling these. I do want to point out that these are thinking about the absolute maximum development potential. So it doesn't necessarily think about the financial feasibility. That's the piece that Callie's going to talk about, and HRNA has done some really great analysis in. So that wasn't part of this residential testing. We just wanted to look at, what was the maximum physical development that you could fit on a lot, sort of outside of financial resources, outside of other environmental issues that may exist. We know you have a lot of steep slopes and topography in Charlottesville. And so we, all of those issues aside, we really just wanted to look at lot size and housing types. So with that, there are financial and physical trade-offs and constraints that would very likely limit and probably drastically reduce the amount of housing that you could fit on these lots. So I just wanted to have everybody keep that in mind as you're thinking through this. We're modeling the maximum development potential, but there are a lot of other factors, physical and financial and otherwise, that would drastically reduce the amount that could be or would be developed on these properties. And we'll walk through this sort of 5 main steps. And one of the things I want everyone to be thinking about as we're going through this, and it's what we were thinking about as we're modeling, is this idea of trade-offs. So anytime there's infill development, there are trade-offs between things like parking, things like tree preservation, things like environmental preservation and affordable units, how many affordable units we can provide, what that construction costs. And so these are all things that are at play. And when you have infill lots, you have a limited amount of space that you can work in. And so these trade-offs are all things that we need to be thinking about, and how we can right-size the zoning districts to reinforce the priorities that you have in Charlottesville. Next slide, please. So step 1, we wanted to look at the different block patterns and lot sizes. It's pretty straightforward. What are your development patterns that you have in Charlottesville? And what we came down to were essentially 2 different categories of lots. The first being narrow lots, and the second being wide lots. And narrow lots really are found most predominantly in your older parts of Charlottesville. And the reason we wanted to think about these is because they're a lot skinnier compared to their depth. So they tend to be about 1/3 of the width compared to the depth. And so that means that it's going to be a little bit harder to get access into the backs of those lots. If you think about it, there's less room for sidewalks, there's less room for vehicle access. And so that's sort of a specific type of issues that we need to think about with narrow lots. And those exist in certain contexts, right? They're usually your older parts of the city. They're closer to downtown, probably developed pre-World War II generally. And then your wide lots are going to be in places that were developed a little bit later on, typically post-World War II in general. Of course, there are some exceptions, and they tend to be about twice as deep as they are wide. So they have a little bit more width, gives you a little bit more flexibility, but the wide lots have a different set of constraints. And that really has to do with, that they're not necessarily located in as walkable of areas. So some constraints to that, you need to probably put more parking because it's a little bit more vehicular centric in those areas, and there are areas with topography. So those issues that I was talking about earlier that would limit a lot of the development, that is going to happen on your wider lots. They're in areas with some more of those environmental sensitive areas. So that was step one. And then the second step, so we have our lots, we have our sort of categories, and if you've read the report, you know that there are sort of different types of narrow lots and different types of wide lots. And it's very similar with the different types of housing. So we sort of categorize those into 4 big buckets. And I do want to just underscore the fact that these aren't always explicitly discrete. It's not like a type of housing would always fit in this category. These are just general categories that we tried to think about and wanted to give everybody sort of a common set of vocabulary so that as we're talking about these, we're all sort of picturing the same thing in our mind. But with any type of infill housing, there's always a lot of gray area and projects that could sort of, well, maybe it fits in category 2 and 3. So it's not that every project fits in every category specifically, but we just wanted to use this as an organizing structure to think through. So we had 4 types. The first being, existing house plus is kind of what we called it. So thinking about how that existing house may be carved up into a couple different units. Maybe there are units that are accessory, either attached or detached, things like carriage houses, even accessory commercial units. Sometimes those are found in your historic neighborhoods. So that's sort of type 1. It's existing house with some modifications. Type 2 is house scale is what we're calling it. And really that just means smaller house scale. It could look like a house, it feels like a house, it just has different units sort of inside of it. And that could even count for things like cottage courts, which are, functionally detached houses, and they're just arranged in a court as opposed to along a street. And then middle scale plexes is type 3. Those are still house scale. They're just sort of bigger house, maybe more mansion house is what sometimes they're called colloquially. And that really is your apartment buildings that are between 5 and 12 units. Again, it still feels like a house, still looks like a house. It's just a little bit bigger. So the width is about the same as a house. It may just be slightly deeper of a building. So that's what we're thinking about sort of in those middle scale plexes. These also may have another half story. So instead of 2.5, they may be more like 3 stories. So thinking about a little bit of height associated with that different type. And then finally, townhouses. Townhouses tend to be a little bit wider than some of your house scale plexes because they're sort of all in a row, right? So they may not be any taller, but they do tend to be wider feeling buildings. So that's one thing that we always try to think about with townhouses. And generally the units are arranged on multiple levels, whereas in a plex, it's going to be sort of 1 unit per level, and they may be stacked or sort of arranged in different configurations on the site. And we have a couple different townhouse types. So those are the general types that we tested, and we really thought about, how do these different types, what sort of land area do they require, what sort of parking or pedestrian access do they require, and how could these different types sort of start to fit and match up on the different types of lots that you have in Charlottesville. Next slide, please. So we tested a lot of different scenarios, and hopefully you all had a chance to look at it. And again, part of what we were looking at is trying to think through what some of the trade-offs were, and that included things like lot sizes, what setbacks would need to be required, what kind of lot coverage are we thinking about, what would the parking requirements be, and if those could be on site or if they needed to be off site, sort of on street, and how does that development look different on maybe a corner lot or a lot with rear access, which is an alley access generally, or side access, versus a lot that maybe only has front vehicular access? And what does that mean for lot size? What does that mean for coverage? And so we really wanted to start thinking about how these different constraints start to interact with one another. And then, of course, the most important part, right, is tying it back to the comp plan, the future land use. And so each of these has a checkbox. And we just took those descriptions from the future land use map and said, does this number of units and whether or not we save the existing house, would it implement general residential sensitive, general residential, or medium intensity? And so it was just a pure translation of the description of the comp plan and whether this, this development scenario either would or would not implement those categories. And so that was the list of 30 scenarios that we tested, and we'll dive into a couple of those on the next slide. And so these are a couple of examples, and I just want to make sure that everybody's oriented to how we listed everything. So we did show each of the lots sort of in a context. We wanted to show it alongside what some of your existing patterns would be, so you could see how the evolution may or may not change over time. And so everything that is shown in white is an existing building. Anything that's new is shown in orange, or that sort of light orange color. And that also could include, so if you look at the first scenario here, narrow small lot A, you can see that we're sort of counting new as that carve out in the attic. So there's basically a unit that's being added into the attic of that bungalow, and then 2 detached cottages in the back. And so that's how we're trying to color code it. And we wanted to, again, show it within the context of some of the existing lots, so you could see how the scale feels next to one another. And in each one of them, we do call out the lot size, the number and type of units, because the types of units have different sizes associated with them, and they may serve different household types. And so we just wanted to call out the number of households, or the number of units, and the types, the type of parking, whether it's on street or on site, whether the vehicle access is there a vehicle access? Is it from the front? Is it from the rear? Because again, that has implications for how you can access the rear of the site. And then what the lot coverage is. And so that lot coverage includes building coverage, and it also includes any pedestrian access or driveways or parking lots. So that lot coverage is fully inclusive of any impervious surface existing in the lot. And you can see how those scenarios sort of played out between a narrow small lot and a wide large lot. But we have the same metrics, and we're thinking about the same things for each of the scenarios, so we can start to think of comparing sort of apples to apples. Next slide, please. And so finally, once we had this array of 30 scenarios, we wanted to think about, what are some of the recommendations that we felt like came out of this that could help guide the new zoning districts that we're writing, because we want to be able to write the zoning districts that get us the outcomes we want, and that would also prevent the outcomes that we don't want from happening. And of course, a lot of that is feedback from you all of, of these 30 development scenarios, are there ones that you think, yes, we want more of that, we love that type of development, and we want to allow that in our rules? Or is there a type of development that has maybe some outcomes that you don't prefer? And so we want to make sure that we have these scenarios listed in the things like parking, the things like lot coverage associated with those, so that as we get into the zoning metrics, they can really match up with these scenarios that we're testing in all the different lots around Charlottesville. So some of the recommendations we came up with, the first are future land use map recommendations. So we really feel like that there are at least 2 zoning categories that need to get at these types of development patterns. And really these are all house scale, but the first one we're calling house scale for the smaller, sort of lower intensity, the general sensitive, and general residential land use categories. So we want something that has very similar form controls to what a house would be. And it would, again, look like a house, feel like a house, and a lot of these scenarios may even keep the existing house. And so it gets at that sort of 4 units and less, something around that, with cottages around the back. So we're thinking about a district or a set of districts that gets at that type of typology. And another district or set of districts we're thinking about are this more medium scale. So still feels like a house, but it may be a slightly bigger house, that sort of mansion scale. And that could also wrap in townhouses. And as I mentioned earlier, townhouses have a bit of a different feel from the street as you walk by. And so we want to make sure that the zoning districts we write would also address that and would get the kind of outcomes that we want for the townhouse typology. And finally, the thing that we're thinking about with, in really close conjunction with HRNA, so a lot of the presentation Callie will do a follow-up on this, is creating requirements or separate districts for those sensitive areas. So we want to make sure that that reduction of risk of displacement is something that we're thinking about. We know that zoning is a really limited tool for that, but we want to make sure that we get it right with what we can do in zoning, right? We're sort of setting the framework so that other policies can come along and support it, but we want to get the zoning piece right. And then general recommendations. So as we were looking at some of your existing zoning districts and your existing lots, we did find that a lot of your development patterns don't necessarily match the zoning districts you have today. So the setbacks, for example, and a lot of your zoning requirements are bigger than what you have. And so we want to make sure that as we move forward, that we're reflecting the character of Charlottesville. And so doing things like right-sizing those setbacks to match your existing patterns so that it is more reflective of your current patterns, so that when this infill development occurs, it is reflective of your community. We're thinking about that. Thinking about how parking requirements, that has a very strong impact on how you feel as you walk down the street, and making sure that we're sort of reducing the impact of that vehicular access and that parking. So we're thinking about those requirements and particularly how that affects affordable housing. There, Callie will dive into that link between affordability and parking requirements. And so we want to make sure that we prioritize that affordability piece. And again, the context sensitive development is something we're also thinking about. So prioritizing the existing structure and trying to come up with creative ways to keep that. And then also thinking about how we can use tools in our zoning districts like variable building height or variable width based on the lot widths. And we'll dive into that a little bit deeper later on. But how things like variable height and variable width, variable lot coverage, and even variable setbacks based on your lot size would help get you more consistent outcomes. So that really is what we're thinking about as we're writing these districts. We want to think about the form, we want to think about the outcome and making sure that they're consistent and they're predictable. So using some of those variable requirements can help get us there. Next slide, please.
Great. Thanks, Christy.
Yeah.
So that was the first section, this residential district testing. So we want to pause here for, let's see if there were questions or comments from the steering committee. As we noted when we started out, I'll ask that if you have a question or comment, if you could just use the raise your hand function, and then we'll sort of call on people as you have questions. And maybe if everyone could just stay muted until that time, that'd be great. We did have one question in the chat that I wanted to address from Lyle. Well, Lyle sent two questions. I think we're going to hold one of them until we get to the IZ portion of the discussion. The other question was, and Christy, this will be good to get your thoughts on this. It looks like corner lots and alley access will be crucial for this. Can we support the creation of new corner lots and alley access, or corner lots and alleys with the code?
Creation is a little challenging because you don't have a ton of greenfield. Of course, you know, whenever you do have big subdivisions that are creating new streets, we do want to think about those corner lots and alleys. And absolutely, yes, that anytime you have a corner lot or you have an alley, it makes the walkability of the environment so much better. You can, it really helps reinforce the scale of the housing. You're reducing the paving, so your lot coverage is lower. You can work around trees. So we absolutely want to incentivize that, and we want to take advantage of the alleys you do have. So yes, that is something we're thinking about, and glad to hear that you're also thinking about that.
Great, thanks. Let's see, so we have two hands raised. Juan Diego, I think you were first. If you want to go ahead and unmute, that'd be great.
Thank you. So a lot of the emails and comments that I'm getting on city council is, and you address kind of the lot size a lot in your presentation, but some of the comments that we're getting on council is like the restrictions of the streets or things like that. So it might be in the land use map, it might be zoned for, you know, some increased development, but the street, or it might be a bridge or something. It's like, it's no way that, you know, this street or whatever is going to be wide. And I know that, you know, it's hard to factor what's going to happen in the future as far as those type of improvements, because it may not be on any 6-year road plan or anything, but that is part of what's giving many residents a heartache. And I know that it will help me to, you know, as we go through this, I'm not expecting necessarily an answer tonight, but as we message out how we're going to address that. And I'm glad that I think I heard part of your presentation that how to save things like trees as part of the development, as part of the zoning ordinance. So more so than we're doing now. So thank you.
Thanks for that comment. I don't know if Christy or James or others had wanted to respond to that at all.
I would just say thank you for the comment, and those are exactly the trade-offs that we're thinking about. You know, this idea of when you are providing parking on site, it makes it harder to save trees, but we know that some streets need that, and so really thinking about these issues and having these conversations, it's the time to be doing that. So thank you for that.
Okay, thanks. Peter, I think you're next, and then Jean.
Thank you, and thank you for this report. It takes a little bit of attending and careful reading, but there's a lot in there that's really amazing. I've shared this with a whole bunch of people, including my colleagues, and my counterpart up in Loudoun County shared an interesting piece of experience where they did something quite similar. And so in general, the idea of infill there is producing positive results. But one not positive thing that's happening that they flagged for me with this particular approach is the consolidation of lots. And I don't recall that we really, when we wrote the comp plan, I don't necessarily remember anything that we did to guard against the mass accumulation of lots to do stuff. So if I understand this correctly, like if you take two lots that are next to each other, say one allows 3 units, the other allows 3 units, you can do 6 units. But what they're getting if you consolidate is instead of getting 2 units, 6 units allowed on this big lot, suddenly it counts as a large lot and you're allowed to do even more stuff on it, which is like, say, I don't know, 8 or 10 instead of those 6, which seems to be sending a market signal to, get, people to sell their houses so you can accumulate. What can we do to guard against that while still preserving? I mean, I agree we should be able to do more on bigger lots, but any ideas about how we could mitigate that negative outcome?
Lee, would you like to respond to that?
I'd be happy to. So the way this allocation.
Oops, sorry, Lee. Attempting to mute myself, I accidentally muted you. Would you please unmute yourself and start again? My apologies.
That's all right. Thank you, Jenny. The way that we have allocated the rights in this particular instance is by lot. There is absolutely no benefit to a larger lot except more area on which to put the same number of units. You do not gain additional units. So the only way that one might try to get more units on a single lot is if it was a lot that was large enough to be subdivided today into 2 lots, then you could get the allocation of rights on each of the 2 lots. But there is no benefit to the accumulation of lots side by side that gains you any more units than would have been allocated to those lots otherwise.
Peter, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let's see, Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. Is that right?
Yes.
So I'm Jean Hyatt. Good evening. I'm with Preservation Piedmont, which advocates for historic preservation, environmental stewardship, and of course, preserving our tree canopy, among other things. Our group is very supportive of this comp plan and the affordable housing and zoning rewrite goals. And we do have concerns and recommendations, quite a few, but I'll just mention something right now. We'd like to see on your map indications of the overlay districts, which are our architectural design control districts, our historic conservation districts, and our entrance corridors. And we'd appreciate the work that has gone into producing these many diagrams and visuals. They're very helpful. We ask that you provide a visual showing an example of infill or attached or detached additions in an ADC district or a historic conservation district, just as an example. And then one particular thing, which I talked to Lee Einswaller about when I came to your open house, are attic carve-outs. Those, I think they work well, except that I'm asking that they not go all the way to the front of the building, because then it changes the architectural design of the building, but that there's a step back before the attic carve out. It's basically, for people that don't know what it is just like taking the attic and turning it into a livable space. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Jean. And of course, would welcome Preservation Piedmont to send along additional comments.
We will, thank you.
Diane, you are next.
Hi, thanks. In the testing where you were establishing a matrix and analysis of lot types to test different scenarios, I'm wondering if you did or didn't, and why not. In that development pattern across the city, there's also a wider and narrower street type. And some of the older neighborhoods have narrow streets, which are already challenged to handle parking and other transit issues. And so particularly as it leads to the product that was released most recently in terms of the recommendations for incentivizing redevelopment by reducing parking requirements from as much as 25 to 50%. The need for the parking doesn't go away. It's basically externalized onto the streets. And there's some streets that are going to be better able to carry that additional parking. Yeah. Particularly, in fact, if a lot in older sections of town, a single family house is replaced with the incentive bonuses up to 5 units. And while we can hope that downtown housing leads to less vehicular ownership, it's also possible that there could be 5 to, if there's 2 adults working, 10 cars in a worst case scenario. So I'm wondering about the trade-offs. You called that testing the trade-offs. The trade-offs were focused on the internal lot. Some of the trade-offs are external, and obviously parking is one of the significant that that neighbors are. I'm on the neighborhood board representing the leadership committee, are most concerned about. It also obviously impacts the public right of way, the planting, the off property planting, the streetscape. And so I'm would like it if the consultants can address the issue of narrow to wide street typology as well.
Let's see, Christy or Lee, would either of you want to respond to that?
Sure, and I'll let James or Lee follow up if needed. And I think that's one of those sort of physical conditions that could very well limit the amount of development that could happen on a site, depending on whether it's on a narrow or wide street. We're really focused on the size of the lot itself, and absolutely recognize that there are different streets that can handle different types of parking. And some of those areas that have really constricted streets, that the person that's developing that property may decide that they can only fit so many parking spaces on the lot itself, and they feel like there's not enough parking on the street, and so it limits the number of units that could go on that property. So it is one of those conditions that could certainly limit the amount of housing that could be built in those areas. And I think that parking is going to continue to be a conversation we have. So that is certainly one of the trade-offs that we're thinking about. And like I mentioned earlier, in things like stormwater and trees and affordability, parking is right in there with that. And so we do want to be continually thinking about how that's going to impact the rest of those characteristics of the development.
I think one other thing that might be worth mentioning too is that reducing parking requirements does not reduce the amount that can be included on a site. So that would go into the thought process that anyone redeveloping a site would think about. Presumably. So if there's a street, for example, that is very narrow and has no on-street parking, it would likely be taken into account in that site design, and there might be parking included anyway on the site, even if it's not required, just because in order to sell a unit or rent the unit, they might feel that's needed. So just wanted to point out to make sure that was clear, just the lack of the requirement doesn't mean it can't be completed. Diane, does that respond to your question?
Yes, it does, but your response, that these make considerations. The fact is, if someone wants to do it anyway, doesn't feel the need to, feels like going for the, maxing out the yield on the site and be damned the parking, it could happen. That's the worst case scenario, but a lot of people, as they look at this, they're unfortunately thinking about all the worst case scenarios.
I think, recognizing that is a concern that, that people continue to have, I think we can certainly look at how we can clarify if there are things we can look at. We can put that into the document as it's updated. James, would you like to add something?
I was just going to add in that I think there's a lot of different topics that come up in zoning where we're recognizing that that the solution lies in more than just the zoning ordinance itself, right? And parking, and particularly on-street parking, is one of those key ones where, the other tool the city has in its toolbox is the actual parking regulations on a given street. And to the extent that we take on a role of managing that resource and understanding the capacity issues associated with the street, right? If it's a narrow street, should there be parking on both sides or only one side or no sides at all? Those are decisions the city has probably already made for many of the streets in the city. And if there are streets where we haven't done that kind of analysis, we probably need to. And to the same point, there's a limited supply of parking on that street, and you can start to explore a parking permit system. If you will, it's kind of the zoning for the streets. And if let's take our parking be damned developer and kind of change the message a little bit and say, if there's a developer who's interested in doing a green development, who's interested in pursuing a sustainability initiative where they're going to focus on that sustainability minded buyer or renter, we have to question whether we want the zoning ordinance to be the factor that says, no, you can't do that. You have to provide parking on your site, essentially mandating that a portion of the site be devoted to parking. Or do we use our street controls to say, well, you're limited to the number of, you can only get permits for the amount of space in front of your lot, for example. And that's your limit. And however many units you put on there, that's how many permits you can get. So I guess my point really, long story short, is that there's a lot of different ways to address that issue other than just within the zoning ordinance.
Thank you for that answer, James. And I think it's real important that the community has the opportunity to hear these options.
Thanks, Diane. Let's see, we have 3 other hands raised. We also had one chat question that I want to make sure we get to. So I'm going to say that first, and then we'll go to Tim. But Lena posed the question via chat. When you refer to consistent outcomes, which might have been in Christie's, when Christy was going through it, but when we refer to consistent outcomes, I hope that doesn't mean so prescriptive that we lose neighborhood character. So I don't know if Christy or others might want to respond to that with any thoughts.
We'll get into this a little bit in the next portion where we're talking about zoning recommendations, but no, our approach is generally not that it's overly prescriptive, but it really is making sure that the rules are clear, that they're administered the same for every project that comes in. That's part of the clarity, is just consistency. And we will have a few more controls than what exists, sort of looking at the form of the building than what exists today in the zoning ordinance, but it's not overly prescriptive. It really is just making sure that everything is predictable, but that it's not overly prescriptive.
Thanks, Christy. Let's see, we'll go Tim, then Carl, then Ashley.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. This is Tim Padalino. I'm representing the Charlottesville Tree Commission. And yeah, this is great work. I appreciate the chance to talk about it as a group. The Tree Commission has provided a lot of recommendations and comments so far. Those were provided to Mr. Freese and his staff, but I just wanted to provide a comment on what Christy presented in terms of the residential district testing. A lot of great ideas on how to increase and diversify housing and how to do things like ensure we're having context sensitive form and keeping the neighborhood character while increasing access to housing and affordable housing. I just want to mention that, treating our tree canopy like a trade-off, like I get where that's coming from. However, with the length of time it takes for new trees to mature and provide shade and to uptake stormwater runoff, I really just encourage this committee and the consultants to think about our trees and our tree canopy as something closer to essential infrastructure than something that can be traded off or swapped out. We really, the Tree Commission supports affordable housing and infill development and access to, dense housing. But we also need livable communities and livable neighborhoods. And we need environmentally sustainable and resilient residential neighborhoods, especially as, the effects of climate change are increasing with hotter temps and longer summers and longer stretches between precipitation. So just wanted to, in terms of lot testing and residential form and configuration, really want to emphasize how we believe community forest and tree canopy are really essential elements to, successful livable neighborhood.
Thank you, Tim, for those thoughts from the Tree Commission. Let's see, Carl, you are next.
Hey guys, yeah, I've worn a couple hats on this committee. I think tonight I'm here for the Bike Ped Advisory Committee, and in that role, I just wanted to throw in my 2 cents on the whole parking issue. I mean, I think it is definitely a concern, when residents can't find a place to park their car because new neighbors have taken their spot. But at the same time, as a city, I think we need to make a decision at some point. If we continue to require parking for every development, 2 cars per family or whatever it is, 1 car per family, whatever it ends up being, we're still making it easy for everybody to have a car in the city. And as long as it's easy for everybody to have a car in this city, it's going to be harder to, improve our transit capabilities, improve our bicycle and pedestrian capabilities. And if we ever really do want to become a city that is less car dependent, we might need to make some tough decisions. One other comment is, and I don't know if this is for now or maybe the next section, but I noticed you guys talk about lot sizes, and I think at some point in the document you talk about not wanting to reduce lot sizes from what is currently in the zoning code, and I just hope you guys can explain the reasoning behind that, because I'm not sure I fully understand. I also note that the smallest lot size that you guys use for your testing is, I think, larger than the lots that are on my block, including my own. And I'm kind of wondering if are we going to set a minimum at I think it was 5,400 square feet, the 145 by whatever it was. Anyways, yeah, I'm curious where we're going to land with the minimum lot sizes, if that's going to be part of the zoning code. Thanks.
Thanks, Carl. So I think the parking comment, well, we can take that as a comment, but Lee, would you like to respond to the lot size question?
Yes, if I could. So the lot size, remember, has multiple units on it. We are not talking about a lot size for a single unit. We're talking about lot sizes for multiple units. And we are intending to leave the lot sizes identical to the underlying zoning today. So if you had zoning that required a 5,000 square foot lot, that would be the lot size for subdivision purposes. But every lot that exists today will be deemed buildable, and the allocation of rights will be allocated to every lot that's out there today. If you could split it today, you will be able to split it tomorrow to the same size lot that you would have been able to split it to today. Does that make sense?
All right, we'll take that as a yes for now. Maybe some follow-up to come. Thanks to both of you. Let's see, Ashley, I think, is our last hand for this section. So after Ashley, we'll move on to our next section. But go ahead, Ashley.
you. Ashley Davies, Charlottesville Area Development Roundtable. And no questions, but just wanted to be sure and compliment the team on this section of the diagnostic. I thought the analysis was really thorough and just really helpful, because as you look through our existing zoning code, it's so clear that we don't have any allowances for the missing middle housing types. And what you have shown in this analysis, I think, really proves that there is a lot of room to carefully add smaller, housing types throughout the city. And so it was just really helpful to be able to see it in this really visual analysis. So thanks for all your work on that.
Thanks, Ashley, for that comment. All right. At this point, we're going to move on to the next section, which is another section of the zoning diagnostic and approach, which is called, well, we're calling it here improving zoning standards. I think the document is maybe called better zoning standards. Either way, the intent is the same. Christy, I'll invite you back up to speak about this.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. So we'll go through, these are pretty diverse set of recommendations, and we'll try to keep it pretty high level. But I encourage you, if you have specific questions or comments about specific ones, then certainly point out what those are once we get through this overview, and we can have conversations about any individual one or bigger concept that you may have questions about. Next, thanks. So in general, these are split up into 5 categories. And we find these 5 categories to be useful because it is also a framework that will hopefully that you'll recognize whenever you do get the new zoning ordinance. So we generally organize our zoning into zoning districts, uses, site standards. We sometimes call those development standards, but it's the same thing, and administration. And then ease of use is something that is just an umbrella over everything. So we took a look at the existing zoning ordinance in conjunction with modern best practices, looked at the comp plan and said, okay, what are some tools that are spelled out in the comp plan that Charlottesville needs that their current zoning ordinance doesn't address? And we organize them into these 5 categories. And that helps to get us started into saying they will then evolve into the new zoning. So just wanted to give you that little bit of context for the framework. So this will be a framework that you will generally see moving forward. So start to think about how these all interact and work with one another. So we'll talk about some of the specific recommendations that we have in each of those 5 buckets. They overlap and support one another. So, you'll see a few of them pop up a couple times. Next slide, please. I mentioned this earlier, but to reinforce it, your existing standards in Charlottesville really do focus on greenfield development, and that's not unique. A lot of zoning that was written 20, 30, 40 years ago really focused on greenfield development. It was the type of development that was sort of preferred at the time and sort of city planning best practice, but we now recognize that Charlottesville is in a different place and really needs an ordinance that focuses on infill development. So you don't have a lot of, 10, 20 acre parcels that are going to be redeveloped in sort of a greenfield sense. You have a lot of infill housing, and that's a lot of what we've been talking about. Even infill mixed use, infill commercial, that's the type of development that you're going to see moving forward in Charlottesville. And so we need to make sure that you have a zoning ordinance that helps support that and makes that easy. So the first thing we need to do is create the standards that actually allow for that. And that really goes into everything from lot sizes to parking to how the height is managed and how those different districts interact with one another on those sites. So we're thinking about this idea of infill development. That really is an umbrella that exists over all of these zoning standards. It's not just one particular thing. And another is that this really helps support those local and small scale developments and developers. And that's going to be part of the ecosystem moving forward in Charlottesville is that local development community. So it's your neighbors, it's maybe some of you that want to really be involved and help build their community moving forward. And maybe you're just a homeowner and want to add an accessory dwelling unit or something like that. And these rules that we're trying to think about and craft for your new zoning ordinance will help support those local and small scale developers and property owners. So let's talk about some zoning district recommendations. So that's that first bucket. And of course, we will get into the weeds really quickly on zoning districts. So we're going to try to keep this at a pretty high level and just talk about in general the concepts, but we're happy to talk about any specifics that folks may have questions about, knowing that, you know, we're early on in this process. So we're still thinking about this at a conceptual level. So let's go through a couple of these and we'll answer any detailed questions you have at the end. The first is managing a variety of lot sizes within single districts. So that's something I referenced a bit earlier in the residential testing piece. We know that even within your different zoning categories or within your different neighborhoods, you know, you have lot sizes that are pretty varied in size, even in width, and depth. And so we want to make sure that we are managing and having that sort of predictable outcomes, even though you have different lot sizes. And so that could be things like having variable lot coverage or having variable setbacks to make sure that the development that happens on those lots is sort of similar in size and scale to the neighbor, even if the lot size may differ. Another is enhancing walkability. So this, again, really just permeates throughout the entire code, but we want to make sure that we have better standards for walkability. And you can even see in this diagram that sort of bright red bar. And that's a metric that we have that is called active depth. And so it's making sure things like active uses are on the ground floor and making sure that those are pedestrian and engaging, making sure that we have good streetscapes. And that includes things like good street trees that provide shade, that add stormwater benefits, but also make it a really enjoyable place to walk. So that walkability is something that we're thinking about integrating into all of these districts throughout the code and all those standards. Another key recommendation that we know is an issue in Charlottesville, because you do have a lot of topography, is this idea of height. And so our standard approach is to measure height in both stories and feet, and that really gets to that predictability. It gets to that ease of use. We'll talk about a companion piece a bit later that goes along with our district standards called the rules of interpretation. And those rules really spell out how all of these metrics are measured, what the intent is behind them, what to do on really challenging sites when you have topography, and how that height is measured. So that rule of interpretation will help say, here's the intent behind measuring in feet and stories. It's to get these predictable outcomes. It's to make these livable places and these livable spaces, and making sure that we're measuring height appropriately as the building steps down in topography. So we will spell those things out. We know that's an issue in Charlottesville, and we're thinking about that already. Go to the next slide, please. Another thing we're thinking about is encouraging development on more kinds of lots. And that really gets to this idea of looking at different housing types, like cottage courts, for example. So this diagram sort of illustrates how, you know, you may have an existing lot, which is that bold outline, and then thinking about how those individual cottages could sort of be arranged around a court versus arranged along a street, and how your current regulations don't necessarily allow for those housing typologies to exist. And so we want to think about writing rules that encourage the types of development on lots that may look a little different, that front on things like greens. So that's another thing we're thinking about. Another thing is controlling for urban form to control intensity. You know, today you have, and we'll mention this a couple of times, that you control for things like dwelling units per acre. Well, a dwelling unit, it doesn't really say how big or small that dwelling unit is. So if it's a really small dwelling unit, it gives you a smaller building. If it's a big unit, it gives you a bigger building. So dwelling units per acre is sort of a density without a form. It doesn't really tell you what the outcome is. And so what we want to focus on in the new code is making sure that the form is right, and then giving a little bit more flexibility to what's happening inside the building. So it's sort of flipping that on its head and making sure that the form is right, but you know what's happening on the inside, that's where the flexibility happens. Another piece of this is managing rooftop activity. You know, that's one of those things that we're thinking about as you have the higher intensity districts, maybe your mixed use districts where you have some apartments or office uses or multifamily adjacent to some of your general residential areas. And we know that rooftop activity can, you know, sometimes have some externalities. We want to make sure that we're managing that appropriately and that it's not creating any nuisances. And then finally, in the zoning recommendations, we're thinking about simplifying some of your mixed use districts that you have downtown. You have some of these, good form standards and you're thinking about that frontage, which is how your buildings interface with the public realm. But they're very nuanced and they aren't necessarily creating that much of nuance in the outcomes. So we want to think about sort of giving the nuance where it matters and then making everything else a lot more simple. So, as you're a person maybe trying to develop or you're planning staff and you're trying to administer the code, we want to make sure that you're really looking at the things that matter and not having to get lost in the weeds of the nuance in ways that maybe would not create different outcomes. So thinking about simplifying those mixed use districts is another piece of this. Next slide, please. Use provisions is, the next bucket of what we're thinking about. So of course you have the zoning metrics and then you have the uses that sort of exist within that. So one of the ways that we generally like to think about use is controlling it based on the impact. And this is a really great example of a difference between the neighborhood bakery and sort of a big commercial bakery and how really we can think about the size of those. Generally a neighborhood bakery is going to have a smaller floor area. And so we can sort of set a threshold for that and say, if you're a bakery under 3,000 square feet, for example, just pull that out of thin air. Doesn't really mean anything, but that is a different use. And we want to allow that potentially more places. That's sort of a neighborhood serving use than a big commercial size bakery, even though, sort of in a typical zoning code, it would be called bakery. And so we're thinking about sort of breaking those apart and managing them based on impact so that we can give a little bit more flexibility to those uses that are neighborhood serving that would be more compatible and wouldn't have those externalities. And then the uses that are bigger that have some of that vehicular traffic that wouldn't be appropriate in neighborhoods, we want to manage those separately. Another piece of this is separating uses from form. So there are often, and I know you have several of these places in Charlottesville where you have things that look like a house, but they're actually a business. Maybe it's an accountant's office or an attorney's office, something like that. But it maybe was an old house that looks like a house. And so we want to start breaking those apart and making sure that we're, allowing for that sort of neighborhood serving use in areas that make sense. And it's breaking it apart from form. Another piece is just updating some of the terminology, using things like household and unit instead of family. That's just modernizing your code. Another thing we're thinking about is the term provisional use. And, we want to make sure that we're aligning a lot of these uses and the sort of standards associated with them with your state statutes and also in ways that it makes sense as people are, applicants are coming for development permits. So we generally will have uses that are just allowed. You're allowed to have this use. And then we had a set of uses that are sort of allowed with conditions. So as long as you check these boxes, you're under a certain size and you provide this sort of buffering, things like that, for example, then you're allowed to have that use. And then you have a whole other category where you have to go ask the Board of Zoning Appeals. And that's your special use, or you have to go get a permit for that specific use. And provisional use doesn't really have a place in that. So we really want to streamline those sort of three types of uses and making sure that, everyone understands, either you're in one of those three buckets. I believe there's the next slide. Yeah. So one of the things that we're thinking about too, or maybe uses that could be, and it's kind of funny that we call this modernizing uses because it's kind of full circle, right? These are uses that were allowed 100 years ago that we're sort of re-allowing in a modern sense. So things like accessory commercial units. So these are things like shop front houses. This is a really cute example in St. Paul, for example. Things like corner stores that, were really integral parts of these walkable neighborhoods and these livable places. And so we are thinking about ways that, and places that those may be appropriate. So we want to give you a use category where, you could re-allow some of these in your neighborhoods and the places that it makes sense. And I believe was there one other slide? No, okay. And then the last one is just consolidating uses. So what that means is that it's not micro controlling uses. So it's thinking about bigger umbrellas for things like retail. And that's a bigger umbrella, and we're sort of controlling that in the district. And then if there are specific types of retail that maybe need to have standards associated with them or need to have special use permits, something like that, then those get pulled out. But it really helps simplify the uses when we can consolidate them into categories that are a little bit higher level than calling out specific types of retail that may not necessarily have different externalities, but they're just retail. So we want to consolidate those and simplify as much as possible. So some of the site standards and recommendations, we'll again sometimes call these development standards. So if I use that term, just know that it's interchangeable. I'm talking about the same thing. The first two are just high-level goals that we want to make sure that we say for every one of these, supporting more housing in the city and supporting public space and mobility. As we're thinking about these site standards, that includes things like parking, transition buffers between different districts. We want to make sure that those two, that housing and that public space and mobility, really that's three, those three goals are prioritized. And so we're thinking about, as we're thinking about transitions and buffers and things like parking, that we want to understand what the impacts could be on those goals. Another one is enabling flexibility in historic and conservation districts. We know those districts are really special and we want to maintain that. But part of it is making sure that there's some of that flexibility so that it's maintaining that from piece on the front, and then maybe giving a little bit more flexibility in the back. And what could that look like from a parking perspective, or from a stormwater perspective, even tree conservation perspective, is we want to be able to build in a little bit of flexibility so that we can help preserve some of those heritage buildings and some of those heritage trees too. Addressing environmental issues, that really ties into it. The critical slopes, the stormwater. We want to make sure that the trees and the streetscapes, that the plantings that we're requiring, that any subdivision that happens to come through or any development, that it's getting reviewed within the context of knowing that you have critical slopes, that you have trees that need protected. And so we want to make sure that those environmental issues are addressed. And that even includes things like, as we update your lighting standards, to make sure that we address things like dark skies. So we're thinking about how this, the environmental impact that, these developments are sort of looked at holistically, and all of these, when I'm talking about trade-offs, it's sort of the balancing of all of these things and making sure that we're checking the boxes the best we can to meet all of these goals. And tying right in with that, are aligning with energy code and building code. This is one of those pieces that's sort of outside of zoning, but we want to make sure that zoning doesn't get in the way of any alternative or energy building code needs. We're thinking about things like solar power. We want to make sure that zoning sort of sets the framework to allow alternative energy and allow good building code standards to happen, and that it's not including any of that. And another piece is just making sure that our subdivision requirements and our site plan requirements have the same outcome. And what I mean by that is, zoning tries to be agnostic to ownership. So if you're looking at a development plan, and maybe it's a cottage court, for example, whether that cottage court is all rental product or they're all individual owners, we want to make sure that there are the same standards and that outcome looks the same, sort of regardless of how those lots get split up. And we know that, in a lot of communities, in Charlottesville included, that if a site plan goes through sort of a subdivision review process, then it could very well have a different outcome than if it just went through a site plan review process. And so we want to make sure that as those developments go through, then they have the same outcome, sort of regardless of if it's different owners or if it's all rental. So we want to make sure that those processes are aligned, and that also adds a simplicity factor. We want to make sure that this is easy to administer, that applicants understand the process, and this really adds to that. And in touching on some of those administrative pieces, I've hinted at them all along, but this really reinforces, and we'll talk a little bit more about ease of use, but primarily we're thinking about allowing development by right. And so that means that we are setting forth all these standards in the zoning, in the uses, in the site development standards that says, here are the rules that you need to follow, and you can go get your permit and build it. We're thinking about limiting the discretionary review process because in general that adds time, it adds money, and it also adds to the unpredictability. Whenever you have a set of rules that everybody understands and everybody knows how to go through the process, then you have more predictable outcomes. And that means that you're going to have outcomes that are more reflective of your neighborhood. Everyone understands what the outcomes are going to be. And in general, we find that most communities are much happier with this by right process because it's very understood by everybody what the outcome will be. And that really is the goal. The other thing we're thinking about is streamlining map amendments within the future land use categories. And what I mean by that is we want to make sure that the future land use map, you have it set, it's been passed. We want to make sure that the zoning districts to implement that are very clear, and the process for if someone is going through a rezoning process, and there's a clear understanding of how those two documents interact, what the land use map is, and then what the zoning categories that come along and implement that. And, over time, as those properties potentially get rezoned, we want everyone to understand that interaction. Reviewing the criteria for approval, that's just making sure that everybody knows their approval process, that as you're going through the permitting, everyone knows the process, everyone knows what needs, the boxes that need to be checked. And a piece of that is making sure that the review thresholds are right sized. So we want to make sure that as developments go through that are more residential, and maybe they're smaller scale, sort of in a general residential category, we want to make sure that the review process for that is right sized for that development size, and that it's a different review process than something that a huge apartment would have to go through. Those are different impacts in the community. And so we want to make sure that the review streams and that those thresholds, as it goes through site plan reviews, it goes through environmental review and zoning review, that those are right sized for the development outcomes. The review process adds time and money. And so we want to make sure that it's right sized for the impact of the development and the size of development. Getting into the weeds of a couple of these, I'll just go over them briefly. Ultimately, we want to make sure that your zoning code matches all your state statutes and your case law. In the state of Virginia, we're working really closely with your city attorney, and you have really specific zoning statutes in your state law. So we want to make sure that we're adhering to all of that. So we will be doing a very thorough check of all the legal implications as we're doing this rewrite. I did mention limiting the discretionary review process, and really what that means is for processes that have discretionary review, things like your architectural districts where either historic districts or your conservation districts, that those discretionary processes, they're going to remain in place and that their scope is clear. And then areas that, where you may have discretionary review processes today that don't necessarily make sense. So things like, you have sort of this density bonus system where you need a special use permit for more density today. And that doesn't really make sense. And so we're thinking about how that probably shouldn't be a discretionary review process, that the discretionary review process should be reserved for things like your historic, like your conservation districts. And so making sure that those processes are clear and it makes sense for the projects that need to go through there. A piece is thinking about non-conforming uses. And, Lee mentioned earlier about a question of non-conforming lots. Well, non-conforming uses is another piece of this. There may be uses that have existed in Charlottesville for a long time. There are sort of these beloved little neighborhood markets, or it looks like, Fry Spring Beach Club is an example here. And, when do those non-conforming uses make sense? Do we want to sort of loosen up some of the allowances on those? Do we want to re-allow some uses so that they're no longer non-conforming? So those are part of the conversations that we're thinking about, particularly when you have these unique uses or these unique lots that you want to make sure that they have the ability to continue moving forward. And I'll close just by saying that we are thinking about this idea of incorporating existing zoning determinations. That's sort of a big conceptual sounding sentence. What that really means is anytime there's an interpretation that happens with a metric, we want to make sure that that's codified in the code so that everybody understands. I used the height as an example earlier. Whenever height is being calculated, everybody knows how it's being calculated. Everybody knows the intent behind it so that everybody knows how to follow the rules and what the outcome is going to be. So as these interpretations happen over time, we talk about zoning as being this living, breathing document. We want to make sure that those interpretations get codified into the code. That, as certain things maybe are unclear when applicants come in, that in the next round, when that code is, there's some cleanups that are passed, we want to make sure that those interpretations get looped in. And it's part of that usability. We want to make sure that everybody understands what the rules are and how they work. And I think we have a final couple points on ease of use. And if anyone has had a chance to look at any of our codes, you'll notice that they have a lot of pictures. And the point of that really is that it illustrates the concepts. A lot of zoning codes, if they were written 20 years ago, they read kind of like a word problem. And it's up to you to figure out what that means and how it applies. And we find that using the illustrations and diagrams really clarifies it. It gets everybody to that sort of same understanding of the interpretation. And so we use those illustrations, and even the processes of, the image on the far right shows, here's your submittal process as you're going through. We want to make sure that everybody has this really graphic picture in their mind, and they understand what we mean when we say things like height, when we say things like active depth. You know, they have that picture that they can go refer to, and it's the same one in everybody's document. Enabling digital features, I mean, that's something as simple as whenever you're referencing a section in the code, you know, we'll often say, you know, here, reference fences over in this part of the code. It's just adding in that linking capability so that you can click from one part of the document to another, and you're not having to, you know, flip through a PDF that isn't smart. We're also thinking about things like updating definitions so that they're aligned with one another, using plain English drafting, so that the diagnostic document really was an example of that, where we try to use, you know, not legalese, where, you know, henceforth, or, you know, things like that. These are plain English drafting styles that really take away that extraneous language that is unnecessary in a zoning code. We try to come up with an intuitive outline. So we'll be reorganizing the outline of your current code into those sort of buckets that I mentioned earlier of districts, uses, standards, and administration. So that will be recognizable, and we try to make that intuitive so that everybody can sort of go through the steps of their development plan, and it's in sync with how you would go through the code. And that's just being consistent with terminology, and then adding things like that rules of interpretation. So it really is just making sure everybody's on the same page, and it's an understood set of rules that ends up resulting in these predictable outcomes. I think I got through all of that. It was a lot. Happy to answer questions and details if folks have them.
Yeah, Christy, thanks for that overview. You're a true champion of getting through those slides. We'll give her a second here to catch her breath. If you have a question, please go ahead and do the raise your hand function, and we will go through the hands as they come up here. And then after we go through the Q&A portion here, we will take a brief break, and then we'll go into the inclusionary zoning piece. So we will still take a break even if we're a little bit behind. I know it's a long meeting. So first hand up is Ashley Davies. So go ahead, Ashley.
Yes, thank you. So I was just wondering, this kind of hits on what you were just speaking about with the zoning document. I was wondering if the city is going to continue to engage with your group as they have amendments, or if there will be the ability. I'm just wondering, looking to the future of this living document, how does it get updated but maintain kind of the same level of consistency that your group will provide initially? And how does that also function with the Muni code setup? Those sorts of things, like wondering about the practicality of future updates.
I guess I'll, thanks for that question, Ashley. I'll invite James maybe to speak to that, if he would.
Hi, yeah. So we're gonna bring the capacity to do those types of updates in-house, both by bringing on getting new software, and by making sure we know how to do the types of amendments that we need to be able to make, including for like illustrations. We would probably outsource either to these consultants or to others what new illustrations might be necessary. But for text amendments, we would bring on that capacity. Unfortunately, and actually I think Lee can speak better to Muni code itself, but Muni code is not terribly good at supporting this type of layout and illustration for a code. It's really good kind of at standard city codes, which are just kind of text based in columns, but not great at something that's at this level of kind of design. So it's better to have a searchable hyperlinked PDF document that can be found online and then adding in our capacity to keep that up to date.
Thanks, Ashley, for your question. Carl, you are up next.
Yeah, I guess a quick comment. The illustration idea, really, really great. I just probably doesn't even need to be stated, but we, in the current code, I think there are some illustrations that are conflicting with the code. And just to make sure that if you guys do use illustrations, that they are, you know, perfectly aligned with what the code is saying. I think building height was one of those, and Lisa Robertson may have actually removed one of the illustrations concerning that, but we did have some conflicting information there. Thanks.
Thanks for that reminder, Carl. Diane, go ahead.
Thanks. First, I should begin by saying that I, just as Ashley has said, the analysis was very well done, and I really appreciate the thoroughness of that. And I particularly appreciated the video of the affordable housing that we'll discuss next. That was terrific to have gone through that. Really helped to understand it. That being said, I have one overarching comment about how you've handled, this is specifically page 70, what is called environmental issues. I've got to tell you that I was really immensely disappointed to see a section entitled environmental issues that did not even mention climate change and climate impacts. There was absolutely no recognition of climate. And I think that just as you've said, the zoning codes and our whole comprehension of zoning in general has evolved from greenfield development and suburban and single family to infill conditions such as we're facing. I think that the notion of a zoning code that is siloed and not conceived in this day and age in an integrative manner across issues such as environment and infrastructure is really missing the boat, is really unacceptable. And so I think that looking at infill development, any zoning code update, let alone the one for Charlottesville, that's not framing what you're doing in the reality, the existential threats of climate change is again just missing it. And so I think that Carl from the Tree Commission has already mentioned the role of trees, understanding trees and in the role of shade and climate mitigation, of providing cooling, of being directly related to affordability in terms of heating costs and livability in terms of again, of shade, of breeze, the role of soil in the urban landscape, carbon, you know, really understanding. And I'm sure I'm glad that Dina Roadside is listening in. Certainly both Roadside and Harwell of R&H come from a long legacy of environmental planning, starting with the graduate studies with the great father of environmental planning, Ian McHarg. And so I think that I don't need to talk about environmental issues to this team, but I would really ask that I was happy to hear that in this presentation you're saying to address environmental issues, but I don't see this rendered visible in the work to date. And I'm wondering, when will it manifest? When will we see that and understand, so that it's more than just, oh, we're going to think about this, or oh, it should happen, or oh, we're going to hope that they do it. But how does this zoning update really grab onto the significance of climate change in this in this initiative? I've been on the steering committee for 2+ years, and I've been saying all along, Charlottesville is an intelligent community. We should be able to be handling equity and environment in equal ways. And the city has gone out and hired you folks, national experts in affordability and infill and zoning. Well, we should have that level of excellence in integrating environmental issues. And I think that you know, you're incentivizing infill development by reducing parking requirements or cutting off permitting time. Well, how much time will can you cut off the permit process if a developer is willing to put in half a dozen well-sized trees to replace the landscaping that was removed in the infill? I think it's highly believable that the redevelopment of any individual lot into multiple units is going to is going to result in loss of vegetation and increase in impervious surfaces. I think that's kind of a given. And those are both directly tied to climate impacts. Stormwater is already a challenge in this city. And it's the infill development and the impacts on stormwater. Hopefully I'm already, preaching to the choir on this, but it should be well understood. So what's the benefit? What's the incentive for a developer providing a rain garden for areas that are low lying? These types of strategies that are out there and more than just on the side hoping it will happen, but creating in your matrix of trade-offs and incentives. How will that happen, and how can we in this unique opportunity, this significant rewrite, really make sure that we are taking more than a page of again, I understand that document was an initial draft, but I can't tell you how. I'll just go back and say how immensely disappointed it was to see what was represented as environmental issues in that document.
Well, appreciate your comments, Diane. I will say, and I know Tim put a note in the chat and just gave a thumbs up in agreement with your comments as well, seeing some other nods around the table. I'll note we have had a, the issue around climate, around, environment issues has been brought up by others. That's a comment we've heard. So we will be looking to address some of that in the update of the report that will be happening between the end of the comment period and the joint work session that'll be happening with the Planning Commission and Council. But even after the report is finished, it will continue to evolve throughout the process. So that's the comment I would offer in response there. But I don't know, Christy, if you had anything else you want to add. I know we have quite a few other hands raised, so I want to make sure we get to continue going through as well.
Yeah, I'll just be brief and say, I think those are great comments, and they're all things we're thinking about. And it's, part of the infill strategy is making sure that we do put development in those walkable places so that we can reduce our car dependence, so that we can preserve a lot of our really environmentally sensitive areas. So it's something that we, really great comments, and they're all things we're thinking about. So we appreciate you reinforcing that.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to go to Sherry Lewis, who is one of our newest members of the steering committee representing the BAR. So go ahead, Sherry.
Thank you. I'm actually not that new. I didn't get a notice or materials for our last meeting, so I was actually on the steering committee at that point. So I'm really happy to be here at my first meeting. I also was involved the last time that our city redid our zoning ordinance. I was in the Planning Commission at that point in 2003 to 2005. So it's kind of neat to be here again. I had two comments, kind of questions, maybe riffing off of Diane's comments just a little bit. One of the goals, recommendations was manage rooftop activity. And I just wanted to comment that rooftops, throughout the city, we have rooftops and balconies. And we have a very unique city in that we have beautiful views from a lot of parts of the city to Mount Alto, Monticello, Carter's Mountain, but additionally to the west, the Blue Ridge Mountains, and also to the Southwest Mountains in the other direction. And because of the topo of our beautiful city, a lot of these spaces offer basically access to light, to sunlight, to air. And as we begin to reduce green space, these spaces become even more important, I think. And that is because one of our goals of the zoning ordinance should be to continue to maintain quality of life, health, safety, welfare of our citizens. So I'm not sure if the comment manage rooftop activity was a policing thing. I understand we all do that, adjacent zoning uses can have conflicts, and those can have conflicts in a lot of ways with parking, with, use of public facilities, streets. But I just didn't know why managing rooftop activity, which seems like it was prohibiting rooftop activity, was part of our zoning goals. It just seemed misplaced. Because I think automatically we would want to make sure that we manage conflicting zoning uses. We always have. It hasn't always worked perfectly, but I see that as a goal, but I didn't know why rooftop activity was necessarily pointed out, because there are a lot of other ways for conflict. And I don't know if there doesn't have to be a response to that, but I just wanted to sort of point that out. But I do hope that we can, as we restrict footprints, we can think about how we engage humans, you know, in spaces that are part of the buildings, our homes, our commercial buildings, our mixed use buildings. And we have that, a lot of that going on organically in the city, but I hope that can be perpetuated and be permitted by right under the zoning ordinances. My other question, which really was a question, was I wondered, there was a recommendation to enable flexible historic and conservation districts. And I didn't really know what that looked like. Our city has always had zoning regulations and design control districts as autonomous directives that govern the development of real property. And I think, and they've always continued on separate sort of rail lines for good purposes, because I think it can be argued that, you know, where there is a conflict, and if we try to, I guess, allow for exceptions and so forth, that the design control ordinances will always lose out against the zoning, particularly in the current push to achieve more dense zoning. So I wondered what enable flexible historic and conservation districts meant, what that was code word for.
Me too.
Christy or Lee, do either of you want to respond to that?
I'm happy to. I don't think I see Lee on here. Really what we meant by that is just allowing for some flexibility if, you know, in the back of the lot. So we want to make sure that, you know, we know that architectural significance is really important, particularly in the portions that are visible from the public right of way. And so allowing for things like the flexibility of some of the different housing types, you know, I believe attic carve-outs were sort of mentioned, but making sure that that doesn't have an impact from the street and that it preserves that architectural significance. So it's providing some flexibility, sort of, you know, you think of it almost in the back of, in the public sphere where you can't really see it anyways. So that was the idea with that comment.
Great. Our zoning ordinance does provide for that currently. We only have purview over what's visible from the public right of way. So, you know, like sheds that are currently in the back, even add-ons, pools, stuff like that, don't typically get reviewed at all by the BAR. So thank you. That's a great, but that's good to conserve that, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Good comment.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry. We have 2 more hands raised, and we're going to keep the comments in the section to the next 2 hands, and we'll try to keep them as concise as we can, as we said before, but and then we will again take a short break and go to the next piece. So Peter, go ahead.
Thank you. I really like this section. There's a lot in it that's great. I'm also glad that Diane and others have highlighted the relative minuscule portion that's talking about the environment. I can kind of see why that might be. I mean, it's really centered around the diagnostic tool. But let's just say that the actual zoning code, when it comes out, needs to have a very robust section on environmental protection, especially specifically climate change, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. I'd like to see more on both of those fronts than what I saw here. So, you know, it talked about having electric vehicle plug-in, for example. That's important, but it's a tiny piece of the puzzle, really. Like, let's, you know, I was sort of triggered by the rooftop question. Like, let's incentivize rooftop solar, green roofs, and so forth. And then this sort of segues perfectly into my next point. And this is not a general comment, it's a specific thing where I'm stating actual PEC policy. During the Planning Commission presentation, there's discussion about whether critical slopes should be a engineering question that staff can answer. I firmly think that it needs to have a magisterial review process. Planning Commission spoke about how there are other issues that are not technical that are at play with the with critical slopes. And I also, as I was trying to understand this issue, I talked to some colleagues about like, okay, why do we do magisterial review for critical slopes, but I don't know, not parking? And a lot of people said the same one word over and over, and that word was Camille. The need to be smart about how we're handling the flow of water and the retentions of slopes is going to become much more important, not less important. So please keep the critical slopes in the magisterial process. I like what Planning Commission suggested as far as the entrance corridor. That seems fine. So thank you.
Thanks for those comments, Peter. Jean, go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate what Peter has just said, and Cheryl also. I was worried about what it meant by enabling flexibility with our historic districts. And so that needs to be rewritten with the correct terminology for our various districts. I was pleased to read on page 77 that zoning code rewrite hopes to support sustainability by encouraging the preservation of existing structures. However, we're not seeing really very strong disincentives for demolitions in this document yet, and I'm hoping that we will. And we understand a desire to reduce setbacks in order to build more on these properties, but unfortunately that would mean more tree loss. We especially urge you to consider some important street frontage setbacks, as this would help to preserve the original architectural design of a building and also allow for a space for trees and necessary utility lines in the future. And as far as setbacks, taking the average of the street frontage distances on a given block would help in maintaining the streetscape of that block. Thank you.
Thanks for those comments, Jean. All right, all good comments. Thank you very much for all of that discussion. We will, at this point, we are going to take a brief break. Let's can we go to a 2-minute break? Do we want a 5-minute break? Thoughts on this?
Well, 4 minutes.
let's stick with the 5. We'll come back at 7:14, okay? And then we'll get going. So take a brief break. All right, are we all back? Seeing some faces back, not everyone. We will get through everything tonight, and we will have, we'll be here to hear from the steering committee. As as long as we need to be here, we will run over 8 o'clock. I'll just say it right now. So I just want to note, if you're on the steering committee and you need to leave right at 8, please send your comments directly to me. We can make sure we share them with the group, and we can also respond to them as needed. We can get you responses from the team. So I know it might not be feasible for everyone to stay after 8, but we will be here. So I'm going to go ahead and get us going, because this is an important section, and I want to make sure we get through as many of you as we can. Let's see, Kelly, are you present?
Hi, yes, and
Great. Okay.
Here as well.
Okay, perfect. Just wanted to make sure you were here before I transition to this section. So with that, yes, I'll just say, well, we're moving on to the piece of the puzzle that is the inclusionary zoning analysis, which builds on the section in the Diagnostic and Approach document that's called Zone for More Housing Affordability. And so now we're going to dig into what those analyses looked like in our draft recommendations. And then, as with the last section, we'll wait to have discussion at the end of this. So please, if you have questions as we go through, feel free to raise your hand throughout, and we will hold them till the end. We will, in this section, I think, let those who haven't spoken yet speak first, and then we will still give everyone a chance to speak, but we want to make sure we hear from folks. So with that, Kelly, I'll pass it off to you. Just let me know when you're ready to go on the slides.
Thanks, Jenny. Okay, this is great. I'm Callie Seltzer. I'm a principal at HR&A Advisors. I'm based in DC and have been working with the team here on the inclusionary zoning components of the analysis. So we can get to the first slide. Some of this will look familiar. The affordable housing plan that the city adopted includes a number of methods for fostering more housing affordability, including creating more housing opportunities in areas of the city that have historically been exclusionary, and also minimizing displacement on neighborhoods that have experienced or are experiencing displacement factors today. We can move to the next slide. So currently, in your current system, you only have a couple of zoning tools. So not all things affordable are zoning tools, but the two on the left here, your proffers and also conditions attached to special use permits, are, support the city's affordable housing goals. But the work that we've been doing with Code Studio and with RHI is to really figure out how do we increase housing affordability and open up a new set of tools. And the inclusionary zoning is really a tool that's recently enabled by the Virginia legislature. So that's allowing your affordable dwelling unit ordinance in certain localities. So that's kind of the basis of this list here. So allowing more units on every lot zoned for a single unit today, getting more rental and ownership options, creating zoning incentives, which we'll talk a lot more about in this presentation, and then adopting your inclusionary zoning policy, and then also focusing on a toolkit to avoid displacement in the at-risk communities. Next slide, please. So I think this slide is somewhat self-explanatory and not surprising for locals, but you know that you have not been getting affordable housing of multiple bands, and in particular, households below 120% of AMI have been really locked out of homeownership opportunities. There's not really a foothold there, and certainly with disproportionate impact on households at 30, 40, 50% of AMI. Next slide, please. So one of the key findings of the zoning study that we've been working on is that, if you can actually allow for every unit that is today zoned for only a single unit to be redeveloped or renovated, and that is citywide. That there is a ability to create that foothold. Some additional affordable homeownership opportunities would result that don't rely on subsidy. The city needs all of the subsidy it can get in order to support households in those lower income bands. 30, 40, 50% of AMI is really critical. The zoning tools that we're talking about is not, really intended to get at that depth of affordability, because there is subsidy really needed to serve those households. But we do think there's an opportunity to create this, create a foothold here for through infill for homeownership for families that are otherwise locked out of the Charlottesville market completely today. Next slide, please. You'll see from the affordable housing plan, just some of the strategies that we're considering for how do we reduce displacement. And it's not a matter of eliminating or not allowing any development, but really focusing on the effects of that development. Next slide, please. We'll give you just a couple of seconds on inclusionary zoning, but the goal is to really get affordable housing that the market would not otherwise build, and to make sure that the incentives are aligned properly for developers to do what they or the market otherwise would not do. And that's mostly referring to profit motivated developers, which are most of the developers in your community. There have to be the right incentives in place if you expect sort of market rate housing to actually end up affordable. Next slide, please. We had a few program design goals here. You'll note that these are all included in the longer version of the study. We realize it's long. We know that our report is dense, but just wanted to zero in for a second on these goals, making sure that it really aligns with the local real estate market conditions, which are unique, and that we could seek the greatest level of affordability, the greatest depth of affordability that's market viable without chilling development completely, and also trying to conduct analysis that really gets at that impact and has the right toolkit of incentives to offset that impact. And particularly for sensitive community areas, which I think the team is still working on defining those boundaries, but special considerations for areas that are sensitive community areas in the future land use map, and figuring out the balance that's required to get the affordability and kind of the public policy balance with the public policy goals, balancing that with what the market can provide. Aligning everything with fair housing principles, making sure that we're equitable in how this is allocated, and ensuring that units are affordable as long as possible and or in perpetuity. So you'll see the recommendation here of 99 years, and that's in affordable housing, that's about as long as is possible. Next slide, please. You're familiar with the future land use map. We can go to the next slide. We looked at your general residential, your medium intensity residential, and your higher intensity residential areas when we did our testing of how feasible inclusionary zoning program would be for each of these three areas. Next slide. So we've split our analysis and recommendations into kind of two sections for the purpose of this presentation. Again, if you look at the full report, I think it'll be more clear, but we tried to leave plenty of room today for questions and discussion. So it is a shorter version of the presentation that we're going through today. Next slide, please. So we used 4 development typologies for your higher intensity residential. We looked at your mid-rise new construction, rental, low-rise new construction, rental, townhome new construction. That's your for sale, infill, kind of where we think you'll get the most of that home ownership, new home ownership potential. And we also looked at low-rise rehab, and that's rental as well. Next slide. I'm going to actually pass it to Philip to talk through the feasibility analyses. Philip, are you on with us?
I am. I was originally named as you. I use your link, but can everyone see me and hear me?
Okay. Oh, now I see you. Yeah.
Great. Sorry for that. I'm Philip Cash, partner at HRNA out of our DC office. As Callie was explaining, I'm going to walk through these slides at a high level. They're in more detail in our full report. We also did a recording of walking through that report, which I believe some of you have indicated you actually watched, which I appreciate, because when we record those, we never know. And we are going to try to give as much time as possible for questions and discussion. Because there's a lot here. So I'm just going to start out with basically how we approach financial feasibility. And I will spend a few minutes on this because everything else kind of works off of it. We start off by trying to understand the basic development economics of the market. Oh, my son is going to join me. Hold a second. I'm so sorry. So we start with the development. So first is the cost of development. So think of that as buying the land, hard costs, bricks and sticks, soft costs are engineers, architects, design aspects, and then developers actually need to get returns. All of that cost has to get financed, paid for with a mortgage or equity. And then there are operating costs that go on top of that. So cost to maintain and protect the building, property taxes and the like, and your actual rents, your revenue has to actually support and cover that. So that's the required rent. So this is our basic framework as we start to go through all of our analysis. And we use this for all the 4 types that Kelly described previously. Next slide, please. So as you start to put affordable rents in there, you drop the actual revenue that's coming into the property and you start to have a feasibility gap. What the deal that project was otherwise feasible is now not, because you've taken away a significant portion of the rental income. Next slide. So then we start to look at what are the incentives that can help balance that out and make sure that, you know, leave. I need to leave. Go join your brother.
Why?
Because I'm on a call.
I just want to tell you.
The incentives help balance it out to make sure that whatever the dollars lost for rent are relatively equal and those gained. Next slide, please. That's always a challenge because it varies across different developments and development types. We don't want to give too few incentives because that'll lead to less development and actually net fewer affordable units. So if you discourage development, IZ only takes a portion of those. So less development means less affordability. We also don't want to give away incentives. We might, you know, those are incentives that Charlottesville may want to hold back and use to encourage other things, you know, tree cover or rain gardens or otherwise, or frankly, just have a cost with community. So we're trying to balance the right level of incentives here, which requires a fair amount of calibration and always, you know, needs to be updated and revisited every couple of years. Next slide. One of the questions, one of the pieces of analysis, an important part is first, how many units to cover? And the second is what depth of affordability. There's an AMI chart at the end of this that talks about what we mean with different levels of income, but area median income is how we measure income. As you start to discount from market rent, this is the amount of revenue 1 unit costs. If you start on the left side, the amount of revenue, monthly revenue 1 unit costs if you start to make it affordable. So 80% AMI unit means about $450 less a month for the project, while a 50% AMI unit means almost $1,100 less a month. That monthly rent actually supports debt on the project. And as that debt decreases, it creates the gap. And that's the gap that we're trying to measure and understand.
Dad, we pickled them.
Next slide, please. So we looked at a set of development options. So development intensity, design standards, tax fees and rebates, negotiated infrastructure developments, and approval process. We really focused on development intensity and design and development standards, because those were areas where there frankly was regulatory flexibility and there was ability to have significant impacts on the development. Next slide. So the 3 primary levels within those 2 areas we're looking at are increased building height, decreased lot size. That applies more to our multifamily rental side. Decreased lot sizes, that applies more to your townhouse or single family developments, and then reduced parking requirements. Next slide. In the full report, you'll see a series of different sets of analysis we looked at and ran for testing different levels of change. But ultimately, we ended up recommending a mix that's about 25% decrease in parking, a 25% increase in density, and a 20% shift in single family lot sizes. Now, on the parking side, I think this was alluded to earlier, we actually recommended making a change up to 50%, allowing for a 50% reduction in parking, but ended up modeling it around 25% because there is an impact as you reduce parking on the rent, on the market viability of a property. And there's not a lot of comps, examples in the market for us to look at and financially model that off of. So we were a little conservative on that point and want to acknowledge that. We called it out in the full report. Next slide. So shifting from that's more the multifamily to look at the singles, more the singles, so the general residential medium intensity. We went through a process of looking at, okay, if you're going to each and every parcel in Charlottesville, if we're going to redevelop those parcels, were going to be redeveloped, what would be the financially most viable outcome? So I'm looking at a series of typology of different developments that might happen, and then looking at what the market, because market isn't the only factor here, but if market forces were in control, what would that development, what type of development would that lead to? Next slide. So we went through each lot in the city and went through a kind of decision tree about the kind of development that is likely to come out of it. So lot width, access, structure type, and then a set of different development types. And this is laid out in far greater detail in the full report and each of the decisions and how the decision tree narrowed and led to the number of lots, our projection. But this is the basic structure we went through to assess each parcel. Next slide. The expected shade analysis really looked at, again, pulling from the future land use map. We went through and confirmed the requirements, then we modeled out the parcels and market factors. So we're looking at what the rents are, what the sales prices are, what the production cost estimates are, and then what the financial and risk tolerance would be. That leads to, that's based on a set of market assumptions, and that gets a projection on the total level of housing production we're likely to see as a result at this level of density. It doesn't tell us which parcel is actually going to get developed. It gives us a sense of, if you look across all the parcels as this change happens, what's the likely, where are we likely to end up, what's the likely median point? Next slide. So as we looked at that, the over 10,000 parcels in the study area, about less than 2,000 would turn over and be market viable for redevelopment at a higher level of density. Mostly what we saw being market viable were townhouses. So mostly on the home ownership side. And these were largely on, frankly, the larger existing lots. Next slide. The analysis we just went through was not about affordability incentives or requirements, although Callie did talk through how just creating townhouses or higher density housing does have an affordability benefit. It doesn't create affordable housing in the sense of capital A, capital H, income restricted housing. It just allows housing to be built at a lower price point and opens access to home ownership for ordinary families. When we started to look at requiring affordable housing on the first unit built or for medium or lower levels of density, we found it wasn't financially viable. You need multiple market rate units to spread the cost of the affordable unit over to support the development of an affordable unit. And the smaller levels of density just doesn't give you a sufficient number of units to do that. You need generally larger developments. Next slide. So that's what led us, that analysis really led us to a set of requirements and recommendations here. One is targeting an affordability of 60% of AMI. This is a deeper level of affordability and also, frankly, where the market seems to have the greatest need and lines up with priorities set in the housing plan. We split how we're treating properties with 10 or more units from those with 9 or less. And that's really about having enough units in the building to support an affordable unit. So you need about 9 market rate units to support one affordable unit. So that varies slightly from deal to deal, but that's about where it ends up. But we didn't want to take the ability to build affordable housing off the table for developments that are going to be 9 and less. Those can be important parts of how you create affordable housing. So we created a policy that is more focused on voluntary and providing bonuses. In terms of affordability period, as Callie laid out previously, we shot for permanent affordability 99 years. And then on quality, we're really trying to make sure that the affordable units, there can be some adjustments and differences maybe in finishes, but essentially are not that you can't put small units in the basement and count them. It's got to be essentially equal units. And then geography. This is sometimes inclusionary zoning policies are set for specific neighborhoods or specific districts. This is really throughout the city through general residential, medium, and higher entities. So, throughout the residential zoning. And then on the incentive side, I think we described this as somewhat. We're talking about a 25% density bonus on 10 or more units. Then for 9 or less, we're talking about a 2-unit bonus in general residential and a 4-unit bonus in medium residential. And then a parking reduction up to 50%. So I went through a lot right there. I'm going to talk through some examples, and I'm sure we'll get more questions about how this gets applied. So just trying to give a hypothetical example, if there was a development that was occurring, in a general residential, and it was going to be 3 units, and there was a commitment to include an affordable unit, then that development could actually become 5 units. All 5 of those units could be affordable, or you could have 4 market rates units and 1 affordable unit. And applying that to a medium intensity situation where there's the same situation, 5 units potential, but there's a potential, the bonus is 4 units. Then there's 1 affordable unit and 3 market rate units. Again, you could make all 9 units affordable if you had the funding to do it. And next slide. And then thinking about higher intensity residential. So thinking about a 60-unit building, this is a case where you start to get 10% required. So you have 6 units here, and you get a bonus of about 12 units on the property. Next slide. So again, I went through that relatively quickly in the reports in more detail, but we are happy to discuss and answer questions.
Thanks, Philip and Callie. So those of you who have questions, please, like we did before, please go ahead and raise your hand. I do want to address one comment that came through in the chat before we go to the hands, and that is Peter noted, said, please apply the final policy to mixed use areas, especially in those areas, as some of the most successful affordable housing is in areas the Flume envisions as various kinds of mixed use. So I just wanted to ask if Callie or Philip could speak to how this would apply in the mixed use areas that aren't, in the higher residential, but might include a similar level of residential uses.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Callie. Sorry.
Oh, no, it would apply. This is written that it would apply anywhere where there's residential. Agree that could create some very successful projects. It's not where you're going to get the most number of projects from our testing, but it would apply.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. All right, so then we'll go to hands that are raised. We have currently Sunshine, then Juan Diego, then Ashley Davies, and Carl. So Sunshine, you can go ahead.
Good evening. Thanks for everyone for the presentation so far. And as we discussed, Jenny, would you mind enabling sharing screen for a moment? And the only reason I'm asking to share my screen is I'm going to use the same slides, but I'm going to just be able to flip back and forth a little more quickly to make my comments. So if that's all right.
You should be able to do that now. Let me know if you can.
Yep, that's great. Thank you. So I want to start by saying that I want to echo kind of a similar level of respect and thankfulness for the detail and depth of the analysis that we see in the inclusionary zoning plan, just like we've seen in other aspects of the plan. Not only do I think the details are accurate, I think that they bear out based on experience. So just I want to start with that predicate. But I also want to acknowledge initially that inclusionary zoning, as Callie pointed out, is not a silver bullet. This is not the only solution by which to achieve affordable housing in the city. Just there are a multiplicity of efforts that need to be taken advantage of to do that. But I do think I want to make 3 main points that I think warrant highlighting that deserve consideration and kind of refining the proposal that's out there now. And I want to start by acknowledging, and I color coded a little bit just to make it a little easier for me to describe. So on the left, where you have the public policy objectives, and on the right, the sort of the bluer project feasibility, 100% agree with the way that Philip and Callie laid it out there. You need the goal of achieving affordability requires public incentives, requires effectively some form of subsidy to achieve those units. And I also want to agree. I agree that on the left-hand side with it where it's green, that those policy objectives are 3 interrelated goals, and each of them is its own sort of dial or lever. So in other words, if you take affordability level, if you have it at 60% AMI, that's your affordability threshold versus 30% AMI as your affordability threshold. That has dollar cost. And I think Philip did a good job of outlining what the potential cost differences look like. Similarly, the number of units as a ratio, 1 of 10 or 2 of 10 or 8 of 10 or whatever the ratio is, the more affordable units, the more incentive or the more subsidy that's required. And then lastly, the length of affordability, whether it's 5 years, 40 years, or 99 years, each of those has a cost to the developer. So in each of our public policy statements, we're turning the dials of each of those areas to achieve what we think our community deserves and should be getting. Now, the flip side is what, again, what Philip and Kelly laid out, which is the incentives piece, which, another way of phrasing that is around subsidy. So you can subsidize that through different typologies of incentives, different lengths and sizes. So bottom line, I agree with all of that. But each of those incentives also has dials. You can change the level of the size of the incentives, the length and term of the incentives, et cetera. So the way I think about how we pursue affordability is by managing those dials. And one is the feasibility side, as Philip highlighted, and the other is sort of the public policy goals. What do we actually want to achieve? And they are related to each other, and sometimes one drives the other. And that's the kind of the nature of my comments. So the key part, and then the key part that I wanted to highlight is that, in the document, it highlights, as Philip went over, there are these 5 ways of incentivizing affordability. The part that I want to push back on and is that the first 2, the development intensity and the design development standards, are the only 2 of the 5 potential dials that the inclusionary zoning program is turning. So it leaves approval processes, tax abatement, fee abatement, et cetera. It leaves those on the table, which means that the analysis that was provided is, I believe, is 100% accurate in terms of the measurement of the cost and the outcomes and feasibility of the dials that are turned under the first 2 under the green areas. But since we are not applying approval processes dial, or we're not turning the tax abatement dial, we're not able to achieve either deeper levels of affordability or more units of affordability to get at what we want. So what we see in front of us, as Philip just kind of recapped, is the program recommendations of the 60% AMI, mandatory 10% above 10 units, et cetera. I fundamentally believe that we can actually do better than that, whether it's by turning down the affordability level to 50% AMI, say perhaps, or even 40, or alternatively, a higher percentage of affordable units. We have the opportunity to do that by turning some of those blue dials, by turning the tax incentive dial, et cetera. And I think right now what we're seeing is, even though I agree with Callie's first statement that the inclusionary zoning program, as I said, is not the silver bullet, it's not going to address all of our means of getting affordable units. But I do think right now it occurs as pretty underwhelming in terms of our public policy goals, what we're actually trying to achieve. In other words, what the requirements that are laid out there. And I've heard that over the last couple of weeks pretty consistently from peer organizations, from CLIC, from a couple of neighborhood groups, that the goal of achieving the opportunity for more affordability as we look at increasing density and so forth, we should be pushing it harder. We should be pushing it farther. in order to do that, we need to be applying those other tools, tax abatement being the primary. So that's my first primary point that I want to highlight. The second point is,
So, okay, sorry, Sunshine, not to interrupt. I will just ask that we try to keep these as concise as we can, just because we got a lot of people to get through, but please continue.
Understood. I will never be quick. So the second point is that back during the comprehensive plan process, Dan Rosenzweig and I presented an affordable housing overlay framework to strengthen the idea of sort of density with purpose. The plan, as we see it now, went in a different direction, which is so be it. But I want to resurface a core concept and argue that it can have a place in the current IZ proposal. And specifically, with very few exceptions, if we, and by we, I mean nonprofits or organizations that are trying to do higher levels of affordability, if we want to pursue a site in the city, particularly in general residential or medium residential areas, we will almost never be able to compete with market rate developers on cost. The dial that we can turn to level that playing field is, and sorry, moving forward the slide there, the dial we can turn is by allowing for more density. So when we proposed the idea of an affordable housing overlay based on the Cambridge inclusionary zoning model back a number of months ago, the one key tool that I would suggest we want to revisit and potentially include is the ability for nonprofits or majority affordable housing projects to go beyond the allowable density thresholds that you see here. And the reason for that is that allows us to distribute the cost of the land over more units, which then levels the playing field between ourselves and market rate developers who can otherwise, pay top dollar for sites. So that's a key opportunity for us to augment this proposal to really level the playing field and really make it opportunity. The last piece I'll point out, and then I'll be done, is that on the permanent affordability on the term here in the 99 years, absolutely 100% agree that increasing the length of affordability makes absolute sense and fully supportive of that. I want to be careful with how we structure that language, in part because 99-year affordability works relatively well in the context of rental units. But if you're talking about, for example, an affordable homeownership unit like a Habitat model unit, that requirement doesn't fit well with that. So I want to make sure we're not precluding and shooting ourselves in the foot with how we structure those affordability terms, although our goal should be overall to strengthen and lengthen them. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunshine, for those comments. I guess I'll ask if anyone would like to provide a response to those comments from the team or city.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Sunshine. It was really helpful, and you're right. You're right to point out that we've really zeroed in on the development intensity and the design development standards. I think that to the question of tax abatement and approval processes, we modeled those other tools. What we found is there just isn't much of a financial incentive created. Although I think tax abatement is a question, like depending on the level of tax abatement, that could be a very powerful tool. But of course that, has to, that's a bigger discussion for the city. So would definitely be open to talking about that more, modeling in that differently, figure out what is, allowable in terms of a rebate if that's something the city wants to pursue. And I guess on the overlay question, Philip, do you want to talk about the overlay? I know we looked at it briefly.
Sure. I mean, just going back on the tax abatement side, it's just the challenge is a dollar for dollar reduction in revenue. And are those units buying down affordability on these units where you want to spend the money? Same thing for infrastructure. And then your elected officials and council and planning board are not interested or willing to give up development approval control. So we can't model a streamlined approval process because no developer will believe us because they're not willing to actually give up development control. Obviously that's a place where we're interested, but understand you are all here because you feel strongly about your community, and it's a pretty engaged community. On the overlay, we're familiar with Cambridge's work. We've done work there. I think the biggest difference, the challenge there, the limit is, we're giving some bonus. How far there's comfort going in terms of the level of density we'd be willing to add in general residential and medium density. So how far that gets pushed. I hear like 2 is not far enough. I'm not on that's more Code Studio and our RHI side to look at things, but we didn't want to go farther than 5 because we thought it started, it seemed outside the boundaries of trying to make this fit with the existing planning there. But the idea of, spreading the cost of land and competing with market developers, I think you're 100% right on the development economics of it. I mean, that is how it works. It's just a question about how far can density go on these sites. But I don't think any of your analysis or points are. I think we acknowledge all of your analysis and points as accurate and legitimate public policy goals. I don't know if that's helpful, but we certainly think it's accurate.
When we modeled, and kind of came up with the 60% at, or 10% at 60, equally feasible for most of our models is a slightly less number, 8% at 50, right? So we saw the trades there. It's, there's just not, without subsidy, from what we can tell, a way to get that deeper affordability without, there just aren't that many tools that we can even turn the dial up or down on. And we think we've cranked the dial fairly. I mean, we did recommend up to 50% reduction in parking. That's where you're going to get probably the most incentive.
Okay. All right, so I think there's additional comments coming in here in the chat that I'll ask. Maybe Philip and Kelly can review those. Let us know if there's anything they'd like to add to those. But I do want to make sure we hear from the others who have their hands raised, so we could.
Sure. Just sometimes you can absolutely model it on just an incremental basis. So acknowledge a baseline and do it just on an incremental basis. You can also, do it proportional to the affordable units. So there's a way to manage the fiscal impacts on this. Yes, that is absolutely possible and done in other places. Laws in Virginia get somewhat complicated, but there's lots of ways around them. You guys have already found some with what you already do for owner occupants. So creativity can usually get around most of those barriers.
All right.
Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to go on to our next hand, which, as I noted in the chat, we had committed to having those who haven't spoken yet go first. So Michael Payne, I believe that would be you.
Sure. Others said thank you. I think the report had a lot of good information, and I think we're all just wrestling how to make it as strong as possible while recognizing inclusionary zoning is just one tool with its own uses and limitations. All that said, I would echo some of the points raised by Sunshine. I would say I'm particularly interested in what are uses of tax abatements? Could that be useful, as well as majority affordable developments? Having an additional density bonus or other bonuses more generally, if they're providing a level of affordability beyond even just 10% of units. The other thought I had is just wondering if there's any kind of way to more systematically partner inclusionary zoning with housing vouchers and CRHA. Like every community, we have a big wait list for vouchers and not enough units to pair the vouchers with. And is there any kind of more systematic way to have inclusionary zoning help get through that backlog and have them be voucher eligible units that CRHA is able to identify and partner with and get through that wait list that way?
Sure. So my face lit up. We did some analysis for New Haven, Connecticut, and they had, they have many of the same values your community does, and we were up creating an inclusionary zoning policy there. We wanted to get to much deeper levels of affordability, but households at 30% AMI have much lower incomes and therefore can't pay the rent, and it crashes the viability in the deal. So what they are piloting, and I can't say that this works, it's in the early days, they're trying it. They have a portion of their units that are affordable units, same as exactly what we've described for you all. And then they have an additional portion, about 5%, I think is where we ended up, that are first right of refusal for voucher holders. And they have a partnership with Elm City, which is their housing authority. And those vouchers actually paid, again, I'm getting a little technical here, but they have flexibility on their rents, is they're actually able to pay pretty close to market rent. So the landlord is actually not taking much of a haircut on the rent. So there's not much financial impact. So we're actually getting to more units at deeper levels of affordability. The major challenge in that model, and I don't want to ever downplay this, is administrative. You have to have a process that gets people into those units and doesn't have the units sit empty, or you really have you do a serious amount of damage to the financials of your developer, and really you can sink a development very quickly. Adding a couple months on these units every year can lead to a real very, very significant harm. So that's a model we're happy to connect with folks in New Haven, have them talk about. We think it's an interesting model, but it requires some flexibility on vouchers that I don't think we have in Charlottesville. So we have to come at it somewhat differently. And it really takes a strong partner in the housing authority to get the vouchers placed. There are examples of nonprofit, and actually I think there's even one for-profit entity that helps broker those kind of relationships more broadly outside of inclusionary zoning. We're doing some work down in Charlotte related to that. So there's ways to do it, but again, it's administratively, it's complicated.
Thanks, Philip. And thanks, Michael, for your comment. I think I don't see any other hands of folks we haven't heard from yet, so we're going to go back around the table, and I think Ashley Davies, you will be next.
Thank you. Yeah, I think in general, just feeling like the analysis was strong, but it doesn't really show a real collaborative intent on the side of the city. And as Sunshine said, really starting to leverage all the tools that are available. And I don't know, I know you don't have control over all of those sides of it, but I think that if we're really going to add to affordable housing in this community, it takes everyone coming to the table and really leveraging all of those tools to get as much affordability as possible versus just pushing it onto one side of the table. So I hope that we'll be able to continue to have those discussions about everything that goes into that, so we can really move the needle on affordability. And I think too, I was just wondering, there are a lot of areas in the future land use map that are shown as this medium intensity residential, and I'm just a bit confused about how what we've seen in the zoning presentation overlays with the inclusionary zoning, because in those middle intensity or medium intensity districts, it seems like on one side they're saying you can do up to 12 units per lot, but the only examples you all were providing was you basically only get the same amount of units as the general residential, and then you had up to, I know you're trying to, I guess, show this how this lower intensity might work, but that was a bit confusing to me. And I think that people are going to be really interested in how that medium density residential works, and whether, what is the actual amount of units, and is it really any different than that general residential? So that was a bit confusing to me.
Happy to try to speak to some of that. Well, try to speak all of it, but hopefully give at least a partial answer there. Starting with the medium density, I probably picked the wrong example. I picked an example that wouldn't knock us over into 10 units, because in a medium density site, if you get to 10 units, you have a mandatory affordable unit required. So I picked one that I could get 4 bonus units and still not get to 10. So it capped me out at 5. So that might not have been the most reflective of medium density overall. So that was, I hear the feedback. When we present in the future, I'll make sure to show some other examples. I think that was, I muddied the waters there, and I acknowledge that. In terms of how this layers in with the existing zone, the idea is for this to be extra to allow for additional density. And Christy or Code Studio might be better to talk about that in more detail, or Jennifer. But the idea is to give, partially, I think the point Sunshine's making earlier, if you're doing affordable housing, you get to build more. If you want to use all of that for affordable housing, great. But we are trying to give you some financial incentive, even if it's not enough to cover the affordable unit. I don't know if anyone else on our team wants to speak to that in greater detail.
I'm not sure I remember sorry, this cat is in my way. The exact comment related to that one, but Christy, I don't know if you or Lee have thoughts on that. The other thing I'll say is, before we go off Ashley's comment, it'd be good to speak about what, whether we can leverage all tools, or are we just focusing on the ones we had in there. But yeah, Christy or Lee, did you want to speak to that?
So I'm happy to mention that this was a very zoning specific conversation. It was not a look at the full spectrum of tools. Although HRNA has had a glance at them and kind of talked to us about them generally, the principal issues we were looking at are what could we generate with changes to the zoning.
In terms of, so Lyle, I hear your question on this. I think you're asking the same question Ashley's asking, just restating it. And I want to make sure we're saying no, because I hear the question, and we spend a fair amount of time talking about it on our side. And I think this is where, again, we appreciate Charlottesville as a client who actually hires us, plus code folks, plus planning folks, so we can actually all work together, because that makes it possible for us to do our job better. So we had to work together on this. And Lee, Christy, you guys are gonna, when I screw this up, you're gonna help me out and explain it accurately. But the bonus really is to be able to do 4 more units together, and that, if that's about increasing the height on this or allowing for more FAR, but it's about being able to build more than you would be able to build otherwise. And Lee, you had a very clear way of explaining it to me, and I am not able to remember how exactly you explained it to me. But I was concerned the same way. As like, I'm not actually giving more units here, then this is not actually helpful. And Lee, can you talk us through exactly how you got there? It's about designing for the box, and I remember exactly the explanation you gave me.
Well, the box gets too tall or too big for the site. One or the other, as we really push those envelopes. So this is about, leaving some setbacks intact, managing the total height of buildings to be relatively consistent with the height of existing buildings in the area, et cetera. All of that was taken into account for the general residential. In the medium intensity, we're expecting a slightly larger building, and maybe the equivalent, for example, of 3 stories with a flat roof. But even there, we had not talked much about the infamous 2/2. We believe that 2/2, as designed by most architects in Virginia, is too intense to be lining single-family neighborhoods. It's fine to use on multifamily sites or other settings. So we were looking at, admittedly, somewhat modest height and density changes inside the residential neighborhoods, a little more change on the corridors, meaning up to small apartment buildings, but not anything that would be considered a full-on apartment project. So those larger LIHTC projects go in the high-density residential areas and not in the medium intensity residential areas for the most part. If I understand LIHTC rules correctly, they don't really apply to something that is likely to be developed on a limited size site, with, 4 or 6 townhouses, for example.
Okay, so I hope responded to the comment or question earlier. If we didn't, if you want to put in the chat, we can try to clarify either during the meeting or afterward. But I want to make sure we get some of the other hands here. And we do have one other new hand that I'm going to go to, Emily Dreyfus, and then we'll continue with the list.
Thanks. I am wanting just to set some of the stage and remind people of what we've been through in the last 5 years in the city and the commitment that's really been made, because I think the idea of trying to contain like the initiatives within neighborhood harmony and being concerned about doing anything that will be out of harmony, it really needs to go out the window, because we have worked really hard as a community to come up with a comprehensive plan that is much more ambitious than that. And people supported change in their neighborhoods as long as real affordable housing was going to be delivered. So I hope we can really look harder at being more ambitious.
Thanks, Emily. I appreciate the comment. Going to go back to our list of hands here. Carl Schwartz, you are next, and then Diane and Peter.
All right. I hope I'm not backtracking by talking about the general residential districts, but I'm curious. I'm gonna try and keep this as a question and not an opinion, because just want to know if maybe it was baked in. But you talk about different types of units that can be added to these sites, ADUs being one of them. The city defines an ADU as something that is only allowed if there's an owner living somewhere on the site. Has that been baked into the comp plan or your studies for whether sites will be developed or not? Is the idea that we're kind of throwing that out the window, or in a what formerly single family district, are you still requiring an owner to live on the site? Yeah, just curious if that was something the Planning Commission had made a directive on, or if that had been baked in yet, or if that's still up in the air. And then if we are still, well, if that is out the window and now anybody can purchase a single family lot and put 5 units on it and live out of town, is that something that is there anything that you guys are trying to do to prevent out of town developers from buying up a bunch of Charlottesville, or is that kind of one of those things that we're just going to have to live with if we want to get more housing units? And maybe that is just a tough decision that we need to accept. Kind of curious if that was part of this at all. And finally, you guys had mentioned an incentive for if you keep an existing house on a site, you get an extra bonus property or bonus unit on the site. I think that was mentioned somewhere. Does that still apply now that you guys have done your inclusionary zoning analysis, or is like, how would that kind of mix into that, those incentives? Was that clear or too rambling?
No, I think that's fine. We got 3 questions here.
Yeah.
So I think I can answer the last one, and then I'll kick it to Lee for the other. It's the idea of in the general residential, the sort of base being 3 units if you don't keep the existing house, and 4 if you do keep the house, is something that's still in there. So just answering that question. Lee, I'm going to go to you for the other ones.
I just want to say right now, we have no expectation that we're going to have any requirement for owner occupancy in any of the units. That may mean that they're built locally. It may mean they are built by the owner of the house that's still on the property, but it also may mean that they are built by outsiders.
I will say one thing on that. When we ran our analysis, everything Lee says right, and part of that's state law has limits your ability to do this, and part of it's in the zoning. when we ran our analysis, in the vast majority of sites, home ownership is still the economically most competitive option. So building townhouses or single family, like the lower price point home ownership outcompetes, like, again, your developer doesn't have to care about anything. They don't have to be a nice person. They can just be straight up greedy. The most profitable thing for them to do is home ownership. Now, it's not affordable home ownership. It's like 90% AMI, 100% AMI home ownership, but it's home ownership at a lower price point than generally you're going to see in the market. Now that we are seeing, we're doing work in other parts of the country where we're seeing large subdivisions get built that are single family rental from the start. You all don't have the greenfield development that fits that profile right now. Frankly, I think that's largely the only thing protecting you, is that your market doesn't pencil well for that. And that might shift in the future. Like those business models are not stagnant. They are constantly mutating and adapting to new situations. So Carl, that is a real trend. I mean, we're doing work in Durham, North Carolina. This is not about single family upzoning. Durham, North Carolina, like 1 in 4 of all single family sales were private equity backed last couple of years. So this is a thing you should be paying attention to in your market. You need a state that gives you more tools to regulate it.
All right, thanks for those comments and response. I'm going to go now to Diane.
Thanks. This might be a question more for Jenny, your team, or the city, but it seems to me that this discussion tonight has been great, but it's also really the general public, the neighborhoods would really benefit from some of the understanding of why things can and can't be done and what's going to be done. And it seems to me that what we're talking about tonight, this report that was issued in August, adds substantively to there's substantive changes or amendments or additions to the work from what was shown and discussed with the public in June. And I know you have the next section is summer 2022 engagement activities. My issue is what's going to happen in the fall with regard to the public. Will you go back to the public with another workshop to explain these additional information? The public was in June. My understanding or my impression is that the land use plan was out there, and in general category, general was 3 and potentially 4, and there could be some changes. And so now it's going to be perceived as, holy cow, it's up to 5 now, and it's up to 11 now. And to, again, I represent the neighborhood groups in to promote a sense of transparency and communication and information. Will there be another round of public engagement that will bring them along in these changes before this goes to more public or more formal discussion with the commission, planning commission, and council? And to that, is there the opportunity for perhaps a very targeted process of engagement where the neighborhood leadership group benefits from a presentation of this information from some of you, where then the neighborhood leaders can hold neighborhood meetings to have this information trickle down. The neighborhood groups typically don't meet in the summer, and most of us take off July or August or both, so there's not been that opportunity for information sharing. So I'm curious about what you're planning, how this information will be brought forth. I think many of the public showed up in July, feel like they did their due diligence, they participated, and I'm not sure it's fair to expect them to just be doing research on their own to understand what's happening with these additional pieces of information.
Thanks, Diane. So in the comprehensive plan, in the future land use map, if you look at the descriptions and of the different areas, it does say, I don't have the, it open in front of me, but it does say that there will be, it's up to three or four units in general residential, plus, some additional potential units and or height, for affordability purposes, if there's affordable units provided. And that was sort of, it says sort of TBD, we're going to be doing additional analysis on that in zoning. And so that was baked into the comprehensive plan. So in the zoning diagnostic and approach document that was produced in June, which, as you noted, that was the sort of subject of that open house and the materials that were available earlier in the summer, that walked through some of the work that we were doing to create this policy. And so this then is the resulting policy. So we do not currently have plans to have another like a public workshop before the work session with Planning Commission and Council, which is at the end of September, but we do intend to make sure that's very clear that that's happening, and to provide, make sure everyone has access to recording from tonight's meeting and the IZ presentation you mentioned earlier that we provided. Make sure everyone knows that's available, and that the work session's happening so they can attend to hear that. And then there will be, as we move forward and we look at how this actually looks to implement or to write up the zoning districts and go toward the map, we will be having additional extensive discussions with the community on that. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's our current planned process.
Well, I think that, I've been working with listening to neighborhood groups. My neighborhood has benefited from the fact that I've been on the steering committee. So I think that we've had a lot of communication. I don't think anybody's complained about awareness in my neighborhood, but there's been a lot of neighborhoods that have not, there's some neighborhoods that don't even have a organization. So the communication, I think that I would just urge more public outreach is going to avoid the reactive responses that that we all had to listen to in the public hearings, and a sense of not. I mentioned in my comments that it was 3 and 4 and then more, but now now there's a number there, and there's going to be people reacting to that new level of information and would benefit from its explanation. So I'm a planning consultant too. I understand the game, but I think that, more communication usually heads off opposition in the future.
Yeah, understood. And what we will commit to is to thinking about whether there's additional ways we can get that out that we haven't explored yet, making sure everyone is aware of it. Since we know this, this inclusionary zoning piece did just wrap up later here in August. So wanting to make sure everyone's aware of that. Let's see, I think Jean's hand is the next then, and then perhaps after Jean, we will move on to our wrap up, and we can have additional discussion there at the end. Go ahead, Jean.
Well, I've already spoken. I have a lot more things to say, but I'm wondering if we can send information or send our points after September 6th, or is that it?
Yeah, you can certainly continue sending.
A weekend coming up.
You can certainly send comments. We'll be summarizing the comments we received for the work session at the end of September, right after Labor Day. Well, starting now, but going, so that's why we've cut off sort of the comment date for that. But of course, you can send comments, questions to us, as we go there.
At least for a few days after September 6th, it'd be nice for the steering committee and others to send in points.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. See, I'm going to go ahead and get my screen back up here. And Lee, I'm going to lower your hand. There you go. Let's see here. Just a few more slides to go through. Appreciate all of you all still being on here. Let's see. So we wanted to talk through the process we've had this summer, and I'm going to do this very quickly, but I'm happy to answer questions. You know, we were able to hold an open house earlier this summer that's been alluded to in June. That was sort of the kickoff for this summer of outreach that we've done. In addition to the in-person workshop we had, we also have been doing a lot of door-to-door outreach, specifically in sensitive community areas where we know we have heard less from people, and they often are, those folks are often not, the neighborhood associations may not be as active in some of those areas, although we know it varies throughout the city. So we've also brought in some additional peer engagers who've been doing a lot of that work, getting out, sharing information, both in terms of having even just door hangers out, but also having some conversations with folks in the neighborhoods. We've also obviously had this meeting, but earlier throughout the summer, there have been some periodic meetings, and DS has been attending meetings with community organizations. Early in the summer, we provided information on the website, Zoning 101. We've updated an FAQ, which will continue to be updated throughout the zoning process, the zoning rewrite process, I should say. We've communicated in a variety of ways this summer. We've got an email list that's growing every day, social media. We've done a couple of press releases, but we've also put out some printed flyers and signage, and we did advertisements in the paper and online as well, and have been gathering feedback in a lot of ways. You know, we had a lot of feedback at the open house. We had about 200 people in attendance, but we've also had a variety of pop-up events, having tables at existing community events. We had an online feedback form, got a lot of comments via email, and at community meetings. We want to summarize a few things we've been hearing, which were echoed in some of the comments we heard tonight. As I noted, we're going to be finalizing a summary of feedback that we got this summer. We'll share that with you, as well as with the Planning Commission and Council and the rest of the community as we get through toward the end of September. Some of the things we've been hearing are listed here. This is not in any way meant to represent a full overview of what we've heard. But overall general support for working to improve affordability and housing options in the city. I don't think anyone's surprised that we've heard support for that. We've heard that at the pop-ups, at the open house, everywhere. We have heard wanting to have some clarity around what it means for multifamily buildings to be house scaled. It's a term we sort of used in the comp plan and throughout the document, so we're working to clarify that. As noted tonight, a desire to see some additional discussion of what it means to have tree preservation, historic preservation, stormwater management, trade-offs related to parking. And as Diane mentioned tonight, and others have mentioned as well, wanting emphasis on the zoning connection to climate change. So those were some of the factors we've pulled out, but have been receiving a lot of comments. And again, we'll be summarizing those and we'll share those. We have a Q&A slide here, but instead I'm going to go to James to do the last couple slides, and then we'll have Q&A at the end, just in the hopes of getting us going. So James.
Yep. Next slide. Okay. So I'm sure many of you have seen this already. This has been our timeline slide for quite a while. What we're working towards, as Jenny has mentioned, is the upcoming Planning Commission and City Council meeting on the 27th. Where we'll be presenting to them a final draft or a final version of this report, and getting the feedback and ultimately the direction from Planning Commission and City Council as we move forward into drafting the zoning ordinance. While aspects of drafting have begun, I think Lee's mostly working on formatting type things. It really begins in earnest this fall, once we have that direction, as we work towards winter and having an actual draft of the zoning ordinance. And that's where we move from this conceptual phase into something that is going to have more of those. I think, Dan, you referred to it as real numbers. That'll be the draft zoning ordinance, and that will open up an opportunity for a lot more conversation, and we will have a lot more conversation at that time. we're all, for all of this, we're aiming for the spring 2023 adoption. And I'm going to say it, I've said it before, I'll say it again, spring goes all the way to June 21st. And I think we're going to use every bit of spring as we move towards an adoption process. What's on the next slide, Jenny? Go to the next slide, please. Okay, this is good, but before I get into this, I wanted to note, again, to that comment about talking to neighborhoods and other groups, I've been doing that. Others on my staff have been meeting individually with neighborhoods and other groups within the city, and I'm planning to continue to do that throughout the fall to share and explain what we've done so far, this conceptual version, if you will, of the zoning ordinance and the direction we're moving in as we work towards and build up towards releasing that actual draft ordinance in the winter. So I don't know, I have a pretty full schedule at this point for this month, squeezing in some more meetings right now. I've had a couple of people reach out even while we've been talking this evening, but I'm still more than open to meeting with other neighborhood groups throughout the fall as we continue the conversation. So, and to that end, of course, we have the survey referenced here, the email for comments and questions, and snail mail.
I would just add, we've got these comments here. This was really meant to share with the community members who are on the call the ways that they can provide feedback, just reminding them, please share this with people that you know who will want to provide comments. We would certainly welcome you to submit comments in this way as well, or feel free to email me directly. We're happy to.
Right, and I saw a question pop up in the chat. I didn't catch who it was from, but yeah, it's our intention. The reason we're collecting all these comments and questions is to incorporate those into the final report that we take to Planning Commission and City Council. So, all of it subject to our continued analysis. But yeah, we're looking at this, looking and listening very carefully to what we hear, and using that, frankly, to re-examine a lot of the different ideas we've already proposed. So, so yeah, I should just say we've already been talking about changes and amendments to that report, and as we get the final set of comments in, I know that conversation will continue. But let me close. Jenny, I'll turn it back over to you if you have anything you want to say further. But I'm just going to close by saying for thanking everybody for hanging with us here tonight. We went a little bit over time, but this was a really robust conversation. I got a lot of value out of it. I heard a lot of really important things said, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation, particularly as we get into the real real details that we're going to see with the draft ordinance as that comes out, and the draft map as we are working on that this fall as well. So thanks again, and have a great night, everybody.